Hello and welcome back. It's been a while since I last spoke with you directly, and a lot has happened, of course. October 7th being the most significant event. It's really been amazing to watch how quickly the world has moved from the staggering moral clarity of those terrorist atrocities to the surface level bickering that we've been accustomed to for so many decades. I mean, it almost feels like we are destined to stay in this zone of confusion forever. But we don't have to be, right? We can discuss this conflict in more constructive ways. I mean, we can start by understanding that we're all trapped in this human predicament and seeing ourselves in one another, and then from there understanding where we all go off course. Now, don't get me wrong, right? I'm not a Hamas apologist. They have to be totally destroyed. And not just because they pose an intolerable threat to Israel, they are brutal to their own people and they are reckless to the point where they have dragged all of us to the brink of regional war. I mean, maybe worse, right? This is the power of their evil ideas. They have to go. And this war between Israel and Hamas continues to grind on. I mean, every day we read about dead soldiers, and they fight and die like brave lions so that we can have our warm showers, we can take our kids to school, we can buy groceries. We have a duty to honor their sacrifice, and we honor them by defeating bad ideas with the bad ideas that landed us in war, right, in the first place, with good ideas. Now, persuading people away from bad ideas is an art, it's not a science. And for most people, and I include myself, that our opinions change when people of influence change it for us. You read a good book, you watch a kick-ass documentary, an amazing debate. It's really rare to find the independent thinker who just disregards popular opinion. So that's what I'd like for this platform to be from now on. I'm going to speak to as many people as I possibly can so that we can promote good ideas at the expense of the bad ones. Now, this episode, for example, is a conversation with Zachary Foster, and it was recorded before the war started. Zachary is a historian of Palestine. He got his PhD from Princeton. And I sought him out because there's been one question that has been troubling me for a long time, and that is of the nature of Palestinian identity. As far as I can tell, what defines a Palestinian is resistance to Zionism. And if this is true, if the uniting story for Palestinians is negation of Israel, then it explains why we're having so much trouble making progress, right? I mean, if your entire existence is predicated on the negation of another group, that means that any negotiation for peace is based in bad faith and therefore going to fail. So Palestinians exist, and for everyone's sake, either I'm wrong, and that's fantastic, or they need to improve their story. Palestinians need a vision of a hopeful future that doesn't entail the wholesale massacre of Jews and the eradication of Israel. Those two things are mutually exclusive anyway. Now, Zachary is very vocal about his anti-Israel views. We have fundamental disagreements, he and I. You'll notice that quite a bit of our conversation was spent in argument, but I found it important to listen to Zachary because even where we disagree, I learned something about my enemy's psychology. And when this conflict ends, it will be because we leveraged those insights into changed minds. As always, please consider subscribing to the podcast wherever you listen to it. Sorry about that. The more I grow, the better work I can deliver to you. I win and you win, right? We're in this together, and that's always been the case. So please enjoy the conversation. Thanks for doing this.
My pleasure.
I mean, I don't know anything about you.
Let me just turn my phone on silent, yeah?
Do it, yeah.
So that...
Phone is the enemy of conversation.
Exactly.
Wait, okay, so tell me your story, man. So you said you're a nomad. You live all over. In the past 6 months in Mexico City, but who's little kid Zach? Where were you born?
Born and raised in Detroit, Michigan, the very exotic suburban Midwest. Went to Jewish schools growing up. Went to Jewish summer camp growing up.
Wait, and what's your family's background?
My family is conservative, capital C conservative, on the more religious end of things. My brother became a rabbi.
Oh, wow.
We grew up going to synagogue every week. We grew up celebrating Shabbat every week. We grew up celebrating the holidays, right?
Wow.
So I had a more traditional conservative upbringing.
And your parents were like first generation Americans? They were
My mom was first generation American. My dad was second and third generation American.
Okay. So but neither of your parents had family in the Holocaust.
No, my mom's parents were both. Her dad was a Holocaust survivor, escaped Poland. His entire family was killed. He wound up in China, in Beijing,
Whoa.
for 5 years during the war. In fact, if you go to Beijing today, his name is etched onto a wall, along with the other refugees that wound up in the Shanghai ghetto during World War II.
Wait, what? There's a Shanghai ghetto?
Yeah, you can go to Shanghai and see the names of everyone who lived in that ghetto during the war years.
What was it like? Do you know?
It was awful. It was a ghetto. You couldn't really enter or exit, I believe, without permission. He developed frostbite during the war years because you're in this, the shelter conditions were awful. I don't even think he had proper like socks to be able to keep his feet warm. And so, yeah, he developed frostbite, had horrible feet problems the rest of his life because of it. The conditions were awful. I mean,
Shanghai at the time was Chinese. Was it English? I'm completely ignorant of this stuff. So
yeah, Shanghai is a Chinese city. I believe.
But at the time, it was Chinese ruled.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right.
Okay. So, but why did they put the Jews in the ghetto? Like, did the Jews put themselves in the ghetto? How the hell does this work?
These are great questions, which I do not have great answers to.
Okay. No, that's fine. I'm just super curious. But so your mom's father was there in Shanghai, and then how did he make it to America?
I think after the war, he somehow made his way to South America. He had a brother in, I believe, Uruguay.
Okay.
Who got to Uruguay before the war, and so he wound up in, I believe, Uruguay for some number of months. Maybe was it 6 months or a year, and then somehow got a visa to the United States. Where he had a cousin, I believe, in Detroit. That's how he wound up in Detroit.
Yeah.
And then I think he met the woman who was my grandmother. Who I never met her. She died before I was born.
Yeah.
But her family was also originally from Poland. I think she had been born in Poland but moved as a young child to the United States.
Yeah.
And her whole family was wiped out. And then I believe shortly after they settled down in Detroit, I think my grandfather wanted to move to Israel. And so they moved to Israel and spent about a year in Israel.
This is after the state was formed?
After the state was formed.
Okay.
And my grandmother was so miserable for all the reasons you can expect, being in a new country with a new language and a new culture, was not happy in Israel, wanted to go. But I mean, she was born and raised, for the most part, or maybe not born, but raised in the U.S.
Right.
And so she wanted to go back, and I think it went back to Detroit after that.
But you said her whole family was wiped out. So what did she have in America that made her miss that life? Or
that is a good question. Because she passed before I was born. I never had a chance to meet her. I don't actually know her story especially well.
Okay. Okay.
So
so they're your grandparents. This is your mom's parents.
These are my mom's parents.
Okay, so they spent a year in Israel. Your grandma's miserable.
Yeah.
They moved back to Detroit.
Just back to Detroit.
Okay, and that's where your mom was born.
That is where my mom. Correct.
Okay, and then how does your dad meet your mom?
I think they met at a volleyball game, but I mean, they met in Detroit.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, what this is, the 1970s, like, Metro Detroit. They lived in, I think, my mom grew up in the city of Detroit, but as you probably well know, after the race riots in the 60s, was it 60, 67, 68? You had a phenomenon called white flight, where all the white people basically left the city.
Yeah.
And yeah, they moved to Oak Park, I believe, which is a suburb of Detroit. And I think they met, somewhere maybe in Southfield or Oak Park at a volleyball game.
Wow. And that's where you grew up?
Yeah, I grew up in
suburbs?
Southfield in a suburb of Detroit.
What's that like?
I mean, suburbia is just a blob of houses and sidewalks and quiet streets, and you have to drive 2 miles to get to the closest corner store. And lovely place to raise a family, lovely place to, I guess, grow up. You could bike around the neighborhood, no problem. You could play basketball with the neighborhood kids. You could have a pretty normal childhood, let's say, a pretty like desirable childhood. I mean, I think a lot of families dream of being able to raise their kids in such an environment. Look, it's not necessarily the kind of place I would want to live in, but to each his own.
It's amazing that I think there's this quote from Dostoevsky that I'm paraphrasing, but it's something like, if you give people everything they want, they will smash everything to pieces just so they can have an adventure. And like that's kind of it. Like, there is no more peaceful place than suburban America, and yet young people just can't wait to get the fuck out of there. It's like, let's have an adventure. Let's go make a zillion mistakes, just so we can realize actually that's the place where I'd like to raise my kids one day.
Yeah, I think if you're young and you're ambitious and you're motivated, you want to get the fuck out of Detroit, okay? Because
is Detroit that bad? Or when you were growing up?
I think in the year 2010, or maybe it was 2020, Detroit was the only city within the largest 10 U.S. cities that was still in a period of experiencing population decline.
Wow.
I mean, cities for the most part grow in size.
Right.
Cities attract new people. They have job opportunities. They are places where young people can meet other young people. So they tend to grow in size over time. Detroit, on the other hand, again, as late as 2010 or 2020, was still a shrinking city. In other words, still in a state of decline. And you will hear plenty about the revival of Detroit and the Renaissance and the rebirth, and that is happening, but in small pockets, and it takes time. I mean, we're talking about a city that in the 1930s, 40s was the fourth largest U.S. city, was a center of the auto industry, and attracted immigrants, and it was hustling and bustling and booming. And obviously, since let's say the 50s, 60s, it's been in a state of gradual decline.
Did your parents work in the auto industry?
My dad's first job out of college was for General Motors.
Okay.
And then he got a job at Hewlett Packard at some point.
In Detroit?
In Detroit.
Okay.
They tried to convince him to move out to the Bay Area, as you probably well know. I believe HP is based out of the South Bay, Silicon Valley.
Right.
But I don't think he wanted to move to the Bay Area. I don't think my parents wanted to move to California, and so they stayed put in Detroit.
Got it. Okay. So you're growing up there, and it's nice, it's peaceful, but something about you just says, I got to get out of here. What is that?
Look, I went to the University of Michigan as an undergrad. Okay. I wasn't opposed. I didn't hate Michigan. Michigan was a great school to be at,
sure,
especially for someone who's from Michigan. You're paying in-state tuition fees, which back in those days was maybe $10,000 a year in tuition fees.
And every year was several tens of thousands of people, or maybe I'm overestimating the amount of people that go to that school, but it's quite a lot, right?
I think the undergraduate population size was something like 30,000 students total, I believe, and maybe another 10,000 grad students.
So that's a lot of potential for girls there for you.
Well, look, I don't think I was really dating anyone back then. This is like the shy, timid, unassuming, prepubescent Zach Foster. I was a late bloomer, so I probably wasn't getting so many girls back in those days. But
just the idea, right, of the sheer number of women out there.
Ann Arbor was an incredible city to be in as an undergrad.
Yeah.
Walkable, campus life.
Right.
Greek life. Just an incredible place to be as a student.
Yeah.
You're in a village of 40,000 18 to 25-year-olds. I mean, what's not to love about that?
Right. And what did you study at Michigan?
I studied political science and sociology.
Okay. And is that because you're a politically active kid growing up? Like what?
I was politically active growing up. Yeah, I had one high school teacher who encouraged civic activism. And there was a project one year. I can't even remember what the point of the whole project was, but I was working on, was it a paper or a presentation about water rights in Michigan? You had a corporation, Ice Mountain, that was attracting controversy because it was pumping groundwater out of the ground, and it was affecting all these locales, all of these. Especially some indigenous groups that relied on water wells. And so all these water wells were drying up so that Ice Mountain, who, by the way, paid nothing for that access to that water. It's literally zero. So that Ice Mountain could bottle it up and, ship it around the state and around the country and generate a profit. Meanwhile, the people who have been on the land for centuries are now losing access to their land. Losing access to their water. I think that the campaign slogan was "Water for life, not for profit," and so we organized a campaign. We met with the governor of Michigan at the time, Jennifer Granholm, and presented to her the issue. And I don't think she did anything, but yeah, I was politically active for sure.
Did that moment, that interaction with political activism and even the political system, that gave you a sense of hope? Like, well, what did that ignite inside of you? Because it seems like that's sort of set the trajectory for your life.
Yeah, I think
like you're devoting your entire damn life to politics, essentially.
I wouldn't go that far. Look, I think the reason I chose history rather than politics or political science for my PhD research was because I wanted to retreat a little bit from the day to day.
Right, but so just for anyone that doesn't know who the hell you are, I mean, you're pursuing a PhD in Palestine studies. Is that what it is?
So the name of the department that I got my PhD in is.
You've got your PhD.
I've completed my PhD some number of years ago.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
So you're a doctor?
Sure thing. You can call me Dr. Zach if you want.
Okay, Dr. Zach. I will actually call you Dr. Zach. So, Dr. Zach, the thing that you are a doctor in is one of the most contentious political things that exists today, man. Like, you can say you're studying history, but Jesus Christ, man, that's a hell of a history you're got your fingers in there, man.
Yeah, I think it was because I grew up in a Jewish household, going to Zionist schools and Zionist summer camps and Zionist youth groups, and went to Israel with my Jewish youth group in high school. I was exposed to all of this pro-Israel punditry, pro-Israel propaganda. There was no such thing as Palestinians. They didn't start to call themselves Palestinians until Yasser Arafat convinced everyone to drink the Kool-Aid in the 1960s. They never miss an opportunity. Jews want peace, Palestinians want war. Palestinians are terrorists, right? Like this is the narrative, right? And so,
well, it's a narrative.
Totally, it was the narrative I was raised with, though. I mean,
Sure.
This is we're talking 90s, 2000s. The height of the second Intifada is really when I sort of came of intellectual maturity at a time when I think actually for pretty good reason, there was this very, I would say, very active, very powerful pro-Israel movement on college campuses around the country, including the University of Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, during my first year or two at university, I was part of that pro-Israel community. I was going to the AMI, I believe it was called, American Movement for Israel. I'm old. We're going back like 20 years right now, but I'm 38.
Me too.
Oh, no way.
Okay.
So
When were you born? What month?
I was born in June.
June. It was January. When I was a kid, when I moved from Venezuela to Miami, I was still learning the language, and when people would ask me what my birthday was, I have this very vivid recollection of telling people my birthday is June 20th instead of January 20th because I was confusing the 2 months. Anyway, go on with your story.
Yeah, so I just remember having been exposed to all this propaganda, and then later discovering that much of it was fiction. And I think that was really the thing that got me so interested in learning Arabic and meeting Palestinians and studying the history myself, accessing the primary sources myself,
Right.
trying to understand, like, okay, when did these people start to call themselves Palestinians?
Right.
I've been told a bunch of things, but like that's something I can look into myself.
Mm.
And so that's what I did for my research.
Perfect. So this is as I said to you a couple of times, this is a weakness of mine. Like I'm very ignorant about this field, but I have my doubts or my suspicions about this national movement, that it's not. I had a podcast with someone else, a settler in Hebron, and he called Palestinians the biggest fraud, like the biggest fraud, essentially. And I think that's obviously going too far, because I think there are a group of people that call themselves this thing. They are Palestinians. Like, get over it. But at some point, there was no such thing as Palestine, right? Certainly the way that we think about it now. And it's curious for me anyway. Like I would love to know more what happened in that transition. Like what made this, from 0 to 1, where the world there was no such thing as a Palestinian national movement. All of a sudden there is. And B, what is that about? Like what are the things that bind those people together into this identity as Palestinians? So in your research, man, tell me, like what did you find? Like what? I know very little about your your work, but it's something like the first use of Palestinian as a term, as a national identity, was in the late 1800s. Is that correct?
That's right. The first guy who uses that term Palestinian in Arabic is Khalil Bedas, who is a Palestinian from Nazareth. And he, in 1898, he translates a Russian archaeologist's travel guide to the Holy Land. He translates it to Arabic. And in that book, the people of Palestine are referred to as Palestinians throughout the book. And in the introduction to the book, he even says, the reason I'm translating this book is because the people of Palestine need a book in Arabic about their own country. So already from the late 19th century, it's pretty clear people in Palestine, Arabs in Palestine, are using the term Palestinian and are already identifying Palestine as a kind of homeland. And so really the question, maybe even like backing up a little bit, like who is this guy Khalil Bedas? Like what was his upbringing like? Like how did he come to learn Russian?
And
right?
Why even go through all the trouble to prove that point? That's also interesting.
Yeah, so in the 19th century, you have German, French, American, British, Russian, Austrian, Irish missionaries setting up schools around the Ottoman Empire. It's not just Palestine. It's also Syria and Lebanon and what became Turkey and elsewhere around the empire. And in many cases, they're being funded by their own governments. And that was the case with the Russian schools. The Russian government, the Russian Empire, was interested in taking over the Ottoman Empire, much as the British Empire was and much as the French Empire was. We're talking 19th century, the great game, right? The great powers of the world are all vying and competing for who is the biggest empire, who controls the most resources. And they're all vying for the Ottoman Empire. I mean, the Russians had already taken over large swaths of the Caucasus in the 19th century. The British occupy Egypt in the 1880s. The French have influence in Syria and Lebanon. Everyone wants their piece of the pie. And as part of this desire to take over the Ottoman Empire, they encourage and fund and support missionaries to establish schools, to establish soft power. And so you get all these missionaries. And who are these missionaries? Like, what's in it for the missionaries, right? They are Bible-believing Christians. They think the Old Testament and the New Testament is the Word of God. And so they're in Palestine for the purpose of missionizing and proselytizing the region's native inhabitants. They want to convert Orthodox Christians to become Protestant Christians. They want to convert Muslims to become Christians, but the Ottoman Empire doesn't really like that. So it's very few Muslims actually go to these missionary schools.
Okay.
But basically, their worldview is one of which, the place is called Palestine, and so
Who's they? Sorry.
The missionaries.
Okay.
They're all calling the place Palestine.
Okay.
They also call it the Holy Land. But the primary word they're using to describe this land in English, in Russian, in French, in German is Palestine and its cognates.
And the word Palestine, correct me if I'm wrong, that derives from Greek, right?
The first usages of that word and its earlier antecedents and iterations comes from, the earliest sources come from ancient Egypt. Hieroglyphic sources. We have 5 hieroglyphic sources that mention this, like Peleseti, Pereseti, Pleshet. We don't know how it's pronounced. We don't know we don't know the pronunciation for this hieroglyphic language.
Okay.
But basically, it goes from ancient hieroglyphics, and then of course, Pleshet, Plishtim appears in the Hebrew Bible. Right. We also find in Assyrian sources.
But those are Philistines, not Palestinians.
We'll get to that.
Oh, okay.
So you have this root, this word, describing this seafaring people.
Yeah.
That settle on the southwest coast, Gaza, the 5 cities, right, that are described as the Plishtim, the cities of the Plishtim, the Philistines, right. Ashkelon, Gaza, etc. And so these, so anyways, from those ancient languages, Assyrian hieroglyphics and ancient Hebrew, it goes into Aramaic. From Aramaic, which is the lingua franca of the Near East at the time. Okay. From Aramaic, then it goes into Greek, as you pointed out, and between that transition from the ancient languages to Aramaic, it kind of metamorphizes, just like any place name can metamorphizes when it moves from one language to another. Okay. So by the time so oftentimes you'll read or you'll hear people talk about Herodotus, 4th, 5th century BCE, as being the first example of that word in history. So that's the first Greek source. That's the first incarnation of the phrase in its modern version, right? Palestina is like the Greek, right? And then from Greek, it goes into Latin. And from Latin, it gets picked up by the Arab conquerors in the 7th century. And then...
the question I'm after is the Holy Land, Israel, Palestine, all that. People started calling that swath of land Palestine. The first ones to do it. Like, I'm not talking about just... the Gaza, the coastal area. I mean, the entire thing. That was the Greeks.
The first person to use it in a broader sense is usually identified as Herodotus. So he's Greek, okay. And we're talking 5 centuries before the birth of Christ.
Got it. Okay, cool. Okay, so these missionaries are coming to the Holy Land because they're on a mission from God.
They're on a mission from God.
Convert people to whichever way they're going, right?
Exactly right, okay. And they're opening up all these schools.
Okay,
and they're introducing these books in the schools like the Geography of Palestine, Geographia Palestine, the History of Palestine, Tariq Palestine.
Okay.
They're printing maps of Palestine, Kharitat Palestine, right? Okay. So they're teaching these kids about Palestine with maps and with books and geography books and history books and chronicles. They're taking kids around. They're taking these students on trips to holy sites around Palestine. Meanwhile, those same kids, for example, in the Russian boarding school, they're taken out of their homes and put in an environment where they're, with other young people, allowed to explore new identities. I mean, where would you imagine a new identity would come about? Would it come about among retirees, or would it come about among youth who are able to explore new things outside of their parochial environments, outside of their home environments? So I think it's in this, in these schools, right, where you start to see these young people, these students, start to call themselves Palestinians. So we're talking last decade of the 20th century. And there's a few things I would say here, which is, number one, a lot of Zionists want to believe that they only started to identify with Palestine and call themselves Palestinians as a reaction to Zionism. But if you look at these first few people to start to use the term Palestinian, there doesn't really seem to be much of a Zionist influence. There's a strong Western influence. There's a strong European and American influence and Russian influence. But Zionist influence, not really. Now, to understand why people go from saying, I'm Palestinian, to saying, I want to die for Palestine, Palestine should be independent, Palestine should be free, to understand the politicization of that Palestinian identity, 100%. Zionism is front and center. But it really, I think the identity really predates Zionism. In fact, you even have a British consul who publishes a memoir. His name is James Finn. He served as a British consular office, a consular official in Jerusalem for, I think, 15, 20 years in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s. Publishes a memoir in 1870 calling the people of Palestine Palestinians. So already prior to its appearance in Arabic in the late 19th century, it appears in British, German, and American sources already from the 1870s to the 1880s and the 1890s.
Yeah. Okay. So, but I guess the follow up question is then, well, what is it? What were they referring to when they said, those people over there that we've now pointed out, the people that are living there for all these hundreds of years, all of a sudden today you are Palestinian. Like that's such a strange thing to like it's externalized, right? It's people coming in and saying a British consul, a motherfucker that doesn't even live there. Right, and he's telling other people who they are. That's so strange. It's so strange also for the birth of a national movement. It's what the hell is that about?
Yeah, I think a few things. I think there was nothing really that unique about Palestine. I think the exact same thing was happening in Egypt and Syria and Lebanon and Iraq and North Africa and in certain parts of the Gulf and in Iran and in Turkey and in the Balkans, and in Italy. It was happening everywhere, right?
But those countries, not all of them, because, I think that if you have a clearly defined national identity, like, for example, I don't know, take Saudi Arabia, right? There's a family who are descendants of a prophet, and they have a very heavy emphasis on Islam. You can concoct a story that will bind several million people, as it happens every single day, around that soup of national identity. It works far less well in other countries like Iraq, which was again, was just sort of a bunch of British guys and French guys, drawing lines on a map and saying, all right, you several tribes that don't really have that much in common. Here you go. You're now a country. Like, this is a problem, right? And it's why for example, people criticize America's war in Iraq for being such an ill-conceived idea. It's like, sure, let's bring democracy. Actually, it's not even that ill-conceived, because democracy in a place where you have all these different all these different tribal identities actually is probably the best solution for a place like that, right? It's just, it doesn't work for whatever reason. So it's this recurring problem of, Western people coming in and saying, you're now a country, you're a nation, where it's not exactly, it doesn't really fit one-on-one into the reality of the situation. But tell me if I'm wrong. But
I tend to avoid using terms like nation, national identity, and nationalism in my own research, because I think those terms are just so fraught and have been used to describe so many different things over the course of the past 3 millennia. I think traditionally academics believe that nationalism was born in the 18th century with the French Revolution, and it started to spread outwards from there.
Yeah.
And just like everything else in academia, someone's going to come around and say, no, nationalism, I found nationalism in 17th century Holland. And someone else came along and said, oh yeah, well, I found nationalism in North Africa in the 13th century with Ibn Khaldun. Right. And then someone said, oh yeah, well, have you looked at Irish sources in the 11th century? I see nationalism there. Right. And it got it's so absurd that you have a scholar of the Iron Age, an archaeologist, claiming he found nation states in the ancient world. Aviel Rochwald published a very respectable book in which he argued the ancient Hebrews, the ancient Greeks, as well as I believe the ancient Egyptians were all nations.
But you would agree that it exists today, right? Like there is such a thing as
It,
Americans, say,
but I guess my point is that
or British or French or
when we're trying to understand historical phenomenon, and we want to be as precise as we can with the words we use,
Sure.
right? Like, communism came about in a particular historical context. Fascism came about in a particular historical context. If you just start to use that term, communism, fascism, to describe, I don't know, like, oh wow, I found an indigenous tribe in Madagascar that's, look, they have a communist system. Well, okay, but you're clearly like retroactively using that term. I mean, those people wouldn't have used that term, right? They wouldn't have saw themselves as communists. Maybe they probably had a word in their own indigenous language to describe their systems of beliefs and practices. But the point being, like...
Yeah, but, I mean, the Soviet Union was a communist state, right? Germany in the Second World War was a Nazi-run country. Like, these things exist, right?
I think the reason I avoid those terms is because... I don't actually think they're that useful. I think a much more useful way to think about identities is, what are they based around? Okay? And are they based around a religion? Mm-hmm. Are they based around an ethnicity? Mm-hmm. Are they based around a place?
Yeah.
And I think what distinguishes nationalism and national identities from other types of identities, like religious identities, or like ethnic identities, or like racial identities, is that nationalism is an ideology based around a place, which is not the case with religious, ethnic, or racial identities. It's based around a place, but not just any place, a very large place.
Sure.
Usually, in most cases, it's basically the area controlled by the state. If you really think about why nationalism has gotten so popular everywhere around the world, it's because states today have gotten extremely powerful everywhere around the world. I mean, that wasn't always the case, right? Like, go back 150 years, no state exerted any sovereignty or any authority over the Sinai Peninsula or over the southern desert, the Negev or the Naqab. States were not as powerful. They were not able to extend their reach into all areas, even those areas under their control. I mean, if you go back, and the further back you go, the less power states had, the less territory they controlled, the more in between areas there were, where there essentially was no state power, right? So states over the course of the past 10,000 years has essentially taken over the world, and because states want their subjects to be loyal, and because so many states now want their citizens to be educated, and that's become an expectation. And so you have this kind of nation-state ideology of nationalism, whereby states are trying to impose, basically this ideology on their populations, on their subjects. And so nationalism is now widespread and embraced by everybody, but I think that's relatively new.
Yes, I suppose you're right. I guess a few things that cropped up on my mind while you said that stuff. I mean, I disagree with the fact that nationalism is solely about, and tell me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but solely about a place. Like, you and I we're Americans, and you have to ask yourself, like, what the hell does that mean? You don't live in America, right?
I do not.
At the moment, you're in Mexico City, and you're here, and I live here, but there's this set of ideas, right, centered around individual liberty and freedom and the English language and football and I don't know, the dollar bill. Like, there are all these symbols and institutions and values that Americans all share that no one even questions, because that's just the way the system works, right? If you took any or even all of those things out of someone's life by force, people wouldn't know what to do, right? They would be like, I'm not an American anymore. I'm somewhere else. So yes, that way of life is the way of life in a piece of the world, in a piece of geography, but it's more than just the land. It's the ideas that are animating the people on that place, right?
No question about that.
Right.
Every nationalism has its own contents.
Yeah.
You have civic nationalisms, where the content of the nationalism is about a shared set of values around, civic engagement and voting and separation of powers and independent
Right.
judiciary and so on and
Right.
so forth,
Sure,
right?
sure.
Those are American values.
Right.
But the same was of course true of all of religious and ethnic identities too. Religious identities have Judaism and Christianity and Islam. There's so much content in each of those identities. Same would be true of ethnic identities, right? Like an Arab identity or a Kurdish identity or a Turkish identity. There's content there, right? Like what is it? I think the difference is that a national identity, it has all those same things. It has the content, right? Like it has, an Israeli and a Palestinian identity there's a substantive piece of those identities that revolves around types of food and music and culture. But the difference, the key difference, right? The distinguishing element of the national identity is that it's also based around a place.
Sure. Sure.
And that's just not the case with religions or ethnicities or races.
Except for the Jews, right? Sort of. I mean, yeah, obviously, you don't need to be a Jew. You can be a Jew anywhere in the world, but there is a special part of this little small piece of the world where the Jews kind of obsess about, right?
Yeah, that's the case with a lot of other religions, right?
Sure,
but it's the case with Islam as well, right? And same
right.
with Christianity, by the way. A lot of those places are all here. But the difference again is that if I say that you're Jewish, that doesn't imply anything about where you're from.
Right.
If I say you're Muslim, it doesn't apply anything about where you're from. If I say you're Arab, it doesn't really imply anything about where you're from.
Fair enough. Yeah.
If I say you're Palestinian, if I say you're Egyptian or Israeli or French, that actually does imply something about where you're from.
Or where your family is from.
Or where your family's from.
Yeah. So the other thing that I had a big question mark flashing in my mind is that you said you tend to avoid the use of nationalism in your research, in your writings. And yet, again, the focus is you are trying to sort of make boundaries in history of, here, look, people were using the word Palestine to reflect a group of people living in a place, which is kind of sounds more like your definition of nationalism that you just gave me, right? So why the distinction? Why do you avoid the word in your work?
I love precision. I love accuracy. And it's so much harder to be precise and accurate when trying to identify a starting point or a point of origin for a national identity than it is for a Palestinian identity. I can't tell you when, I can't identify the first instance of Palestinian nationalism or Palestinian national identity, because how do I even define nation or nationalism? But I can tell you when the first instance of a Palestinian identity appears in history. That is much more straightforward.
But why the distinction? Because as it is used today, it is to describe a people, a nation in a country, right? Am I wrong?
Totally.
Okay. So why the distinction in your mind?
I think the key distinct. I mean, if you really force it, if you put a gun to my head and say, okay, well,
Gun. Here.
Stop being an academic. Let's just tell us what you really think.
Yeah, of course.
I think if I'm forced to really define nationalism and nationhood and national identities, I think it's all about the politicization of those place-based identities. I think once people go from saying I'm Palestinian to saying, Palestine should be an independent country, Palestine should be a homeland for the Palestinian people, that Palestinians should be the ones who are controlling that government and electing that government, that is definitely a sign that you have a Palestinian national identity.
Okay.
So I think it's a shift from a Palestinian identity to the politicization of the Palestinian identity. I think that is, so when you start to hear people saying Free Palestine or we support the establishment of an independent Palestinian state, which is you see already in the early 1920s. In fact, you even see it before that. Already in the late Ottoman period, you have a number of Palestinian Arabs talking about the possibility of an independent Palestine, already in 1911. So maybe you could say, okay, fine. By 1911, it's very clear there's a Palestinian national identity.
This is it's not a knock on you per se. It's something that bugs me about academia in general, is that they take really smart people, super diligent, super precise, and they approve of you guys going out to do these really, painstaking research projects that take years to, and just the amount of skills that you have to acquire. You have to learn Arabic, you have to read all this kind of stuff, and you have to parse through all this context, and then to come up with a work that hopefully gets taught in elite institutions. You got your PhD in Yale, right?
Princeton.
Sorry, Yale or Princeton. That it's like there's the real world and then there's your research, and like you cannot apply your work to the real world, because once it gets applied to the real world, it instantly gets politicized, because that is the world that we live in.
I wish more academics wrote about subjects like subjects that interest people, subjects that interest lay people, that don't have any interest in parsing through jargon-laden academic prose, that actually just want to know when people started to call themselves Palestinians, right? Like that. A lot of people are curious about that.
Sure, I am. Yeah, really.
Right? Like a lot of people want to know, because this conflict is based around these conflicting identities and these
Right.
competing identities that
Right.
both claim to have to both claim this land as their national homeland. So that sort of begs the question, like, since when? When did they start
Sure.
demanding that and calling for that? So and so that's why I took interest in the question. And I think it's incumbent upon all historians and all academics to answer questions that regular people care about. Because guess what? Regular people are the ones funding all these academic institutions.
Right.
Guess who guess who got a $10 million tax break when they donated $30 million to Princeton University? Meg Whitman.
Who's that?
That's I think it's an American celebrity. But you get huge tax breaks.
Who's Meg Whitman?
I think she donated something like $30 million to Princeton University.
But who is she? Where'd she get all this money from?
I believe she's an actress, if I'm not wrong.
Meg Whitman.
Man,
I'm old or something.
Maybe
Okay.
she's a. Well, we can drop a link to the article that I'm referring to. I believe she donated. I could be wrong about that,
Okay.
but
Why did you bring that up?
Well, because even private institutions like Princeton get a lot of money from the public.
Okay.
In fact, private institutions like Princeton get a lot more public funding per student than public institutions. It's crazy, I know. And I think there was one study that found that Princeton University gets 10 times as much money, public dollars, as public schools do. But I mean, even more so the case with public schools, right? Like that, your PhD stipend is being funded by taxpayers.
Sure.
So you have an obligation, in my opinion, to serve the public.
Sure.
You're being funded by the public. You're honestly not that different from a bureaucrat or a civil servant. You are a civil servant. Your salary comes from public funding. So why should you be able to lock yourself in an ivory tower, circle jerk jargon-laden prose around, the like the kind of stuff that gets published today in academia? I mean, like, no offense to my academic colleagues, I love you guys, but like, it's just honestly just gibberish. It's just, I don't even understand it. I really don't even understand what you're saying.
Do they know that no one can read this shit, or
I mean, like,
it doesn't matter? Because this is the kind of problem. Like, if you're not facing the market, which is just people, normal people,
exactly,
you're not gonna get that feedback of like, dude, I have no idea what you're talking about.
There's no feedback loop. You're not subject to the same forces. It's completely irrelevant if anyone reads what you write.
Yeah.
That doesn't matter. I mean, imagine a world.
Well, it's not completely irrelevant. Like, if people are really catching on to your stuff, you're probably going to be a rising star in the academia. No? I would imagine.
And I mean, in some circles, it's looked down upon. Why are you trying to appeal to the masses? What's wrong with you?
Oh, man.
Like,
wow.
You're a sellout. You wrote a popular book? You're shunned. I mean, there's nothing popular about popular books in academia.
You're kidding. Wow.
The more, especially in a place like Israel, by the way, where academics are supposed to be these aloof creatures who are indifferent to public debates, who aren't going to get swept up in the latest trend. No, they're especially in the humanities, they're grinding with the primary sources. They're translating and transliterating manuscripts. That is the sort of classic academia, and of course it's still alive and well in many parts of the world today. First and foremost, by the way, here in the Israeli academia, you're really expected to be a scholar. And to be a scholar, it means to be actually somewhat, even embedded in the word scholar is this person who's, sort of off on their, off in their own world, just reading dusty manuscripts all day long, kind of totally disconnected from the real world.
This is okay, but this is the birthplace of shitty ideas.
100% agree.
Because if normal people have no idea what you're talking about,
and academics are paying the price right now, because guess what's happening, at least in the United States and many other parts, it's certainly happening in other places as well, is that we're seeing a gradual defunding of the university.
Okay.
Over the past few years, for the first time, really, I think ever, you had tenure track faculty getting laid off because of budget cuts.
Oh, tenure track.
Sorry, tenured, not even tenure track, tenured faculty.
Huh?
I'll send you some of the.
How can you get fired if you got tenure? Is that the whole point?
Well, they thought that too, I think, when they, before they got their, letters of departure. But no, you can, the state can decide that it just no longer has a need for you, and it will just dispense of your position.
But I do want to come back because sounds like you and I agree pretty much on how silly academia can be. But as to your work specifically, right, that you have this distinction in your mind, whereas I'm living in the real world, I hope. And I think, I just living with what we have, right? There are, as you said, these two competing national narratives, and therefore we have this conflict. And in my mind, there is no distinction. I mean, if once someone says, aha, those people living in that space of the world, those are Palestinians, even though I myself am not one, but I'm designating them as such, and therefore giving birth to this idea that takes root over time in many, many, many people's minds. This seems worth digging into a bit more as to what is it? What
is a Palestinian identity?
Yeah.
Here's how I think we should all think about place-based identities. Once upon a time,
I'm gonna make you say national. That's my goal. You're gonna say national identity. If it kills me.
I just like to be very precise with my words.
I am being precise, you motherfucker. Anyway, go on. Go on with your place-based identity.
Well, because as soon as I say national identity,
gotcha.
Then you're gonna be like, well, dude, there was national identities in ancient Greece, and
no. I'm fucking with you. Go on.
Among the ancient Assyrians and Moabites, and I'm like, well, I disagree.
No, there was. I'm again. Correct me if I'm wrong, but back then it was mainly kingdoms, right?
Sure. Let's see that point aside.
Okay.
But here's how I like to think about. Let's call them national. Let's call them place-based identities. In order to identify with a place like Palestine, you need certain things.
What are those things?
Those things are first and foremost maps.
Okay.
Because we're a very visual species. Okay. Have you ever heard of Instagram or TikTok?
I have.
We're a very visual species. We need to see things in order to believe in them. We're really bad at believing in things that don't have any visual format. Like maybe with the exception of God. Like let's and so to how is it that you have a Palestinian identity in the 9th century?
By the way, I would disagree that we're very visual, because if we were very visual, you and I we wouldn't even know what the hell we were doing in this room. In other words, I see a picture of you, your name, I hear about your past. You say you got a PhD. With that information, I assume certain things about you that are more or less accurate, I think, and you probably assume the same things about me. Given my name and my work history and where I live and all that kind of stuff and the language that I speak. And you can place me somewhere in society, essentially, and that, like, society is not a visual thing. It's not.
Totally.
You see people and you make assumptions. Oh, okay, that person's a banker, therefore that person must have a lot of money. Money is not a real thing anyway. Like, we're more than just visual creatures. We have crazy imaginations, like making up national identities and making up religious identities and so on and so forth. We see far more than what we actually see.
100%.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question about that. I think that, I mean, this is sort of the basis for my dissertation, right? The invention of Palestine. It's an invented idea.
Right.
It doesn't have any physical form. Palestine doesn't exist to a physicist or to a chemist. If you ask a biologist or
Let's say that to a Palestinian physicist or chemist.
ask a pedologist, someone who studies soil types, ask them to define Palestine. You can't define Palestine.
Sure.
There's no such thing as Palestinian soil.
Right.
It doesn't exist. You can't ask a chemist what is the, define to me the chemical composition of Palestine.
Okay.
It doesn't have any chemical properties. Doesn't have any physical manifestations.
Okay.
It's just an idea we invented. So yeah, obviously we're great at inventing shit. I think the thing that
So you need a map.
well, so because it's invented, then like how is it that why do people identify with it? Like what it has to take on some physical representation for us to believe it's real.
Okay.
And the physical manifestation that place-based identities take on, first and foremost, is maps. Because you can see it. Now all of a sudden Palestine is actually very real. Look, I can draw a picture I can draw you a picture of Palestine right now.
Yeah.
But it's not just the map, right? It's also the stories. The wars fought in Palestine, the famines that we suffered in Palestine. It's also the food, the Palestinian food. We start to identify things in Palestine, about Palestine, as Palestinian now. Now it's Palestinian. So once the idea takes hold that we live in this place called Palestine, and that Palestine has a distinct geography and a distinct history, then we start to institutionalize Palestine, and we start naming things Palestinian. And then it just becomes part of our worldview, and it becomes so natural that we forgot it was completely invented.
So, okay, as a Jew coming to this place and reading about the history, the tremendous appeal that Jews have to this place is that they see themselves throughout this place, throughout the history of this place, right? They can. It's almost like as if they can pluck themselves out of history and say, look, those people in Masada, for example, right? Some of the things that they were doing, I'm doing myself today. Some of the things they believe, some of the things they read, I'm reading myself today. There's a through line, right? And if you take a Palestinian today, which can be a Christian, can be a Muslim, it's hard. I would imagine. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but it would be hard if I was a Palestinian Christian to imagine myself as a Mamluk conqueror or even just an Arab Muslim conqueror from what I think Islam was born in Saudi Arabia, more or less, right? So like someone who's making their way through what the Middle East at that point. Like it's hard to, I would think it was hard to see myself and the things that I value as in my own individual life manifesting itself in a much broader scale.
I think I would take issue with this through line that you're trying to draw.
Okay.
I think that is more mythology than it is reality.
Okay.
Sure, we find like ancient tefillin. You can find tefillin from 1,500 years ago. There are a few things.
Dead Sea Scrolls.
But if you ask an average if you ask an average Judean who partook in the Bar Kokhba revolt, 1,800 years ago,
yeah,
and to ask them like, what is it in life that you care about? What does your day-to-day look like? How do you identify? The answers to those questions would be radically different than the answers to those questions to Jews and Israelis today.
Obviously, there's so much that has changed in our lives, right? They didn't have Amazon, they didn't have jobs such as we know, like careers or any kind of stuff. But still, the things that what is so strong about religious identity is that, right or wrong, I'm not making a claim on how right or wrong any of these faiths are, is that they make a claim about your basic way of life, like who you are, as like the things that you value most: family, community, essentially that family and community, like that is grounded in a religious identity. And then everything else is sort of built on top of that. So you've got your place in the economy and so on and so forth. And that grounding in religious faith, that's the through line.
I would even take issue with that point, though, because Do you know how you know what the word for religion is in the Hebrew Bible? The word religion doesn't exist in the Hebrew Bible.
Okay.
It was a later adaptation, but the Hebrew Bible refers to the Jews as an Am, Am Yisrael.
Sure.
We're a people. We were first and foremost a people, an ethnicity, a tribe, and we were not really a religion in the ancient world. I mean, that was a later adaptation.
The book is full of God saying stuff. Books, excuse me.
We saw,
man.
I mean, this is not controversial. What I'm saying.
What do you mean? It's God. God's everywhere in the damn book.
Well, all ethnicities and all tribes had their gods. There was nothing unique about that.
Sure.
I'm just saying the concept of a religion was a later adaptation. It was not present in the Hebrew Bible, or the ancient world. That was not a word. If you said to somebody, "What is your religious identity?" and somehow figure out a way to convey that in the native language of the people at the time, they would be confused. They're like, "We don't really have religions. We're tribes. We're peoples. We have our own belief system. Our tribe has our own belief system. Our tribe has our own holy book.
Yeah.
But we're not a religion." Word would be the concept itself wouldn't resonate with them.
Yeah, but you're stuck on the semantic. I don't give a shit if they had the word religion for it or not. It's the actions that are so similar, and the set of ideas that are running around through people's minds that are very similar. Call it what you want. I don't give a fuck. It doesn't matter, right? It's the actions and the way people behave that's the same or similar.
But
right?
But what I would say is that actually suggests that there isn't really a through line. That the through line is something we retroactively go back and try and identify in history, but if you go back and ask those people what they thought of themselves, it would be quite different than the way we think of ourselves today. We see Judaism as a religion today.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe there's this shared, the sense of peoplehood, but basically it's a religion. I mean, you can convert to Judaism, right?
Sure.
So you have you have black Jews and you have Latin Jews and you have white Jews and you have Jews of all different colors and stripes. So it really has morphed into a religion from an ethnicity, from a tribe. That was a dynamic evolution. I think we forget that, and so I guess I would just take issue with the throughput, this idea that the through line that sort of you can trace Jewish history as sort of one consistent sort of story. That there's look, I think there's reason Jews like to do that. It gives us a sense of continuity and comfort and doing these things that we've been doing for thousands of years. And again, to some extent, there are certain things that we have been doing for a long time. I think those are the true.
That's what I'm talking about.
I think for the most part, though,
I'm not saying that I'm exactly like the motherfucker who was, bathing once a month or something. No, but
everything is dramatically different. I mean,
yes,
Judaism has there was no prayer in the ancient world. There were sacrifices. I mean, if we went to the Temple Mount and go try to slaughter a goat, I mean, you'd be arrested immediately if you forget.
Let me tell you something. The last time I slaughtered a goat, really it didn't go well. Okay, and I don't want to do it again. I'm just kidding, by the way. I've never slaughtered a goat, but still. My point is that I think, okay, you tell me if I'm wrong here, but it sounds you probably are more left-leaning than I am, right?
That's certainly a possibility.
Okay. and which is not to say that I'm a right-winger. I'm just probably more right than you are. Okay?
It's fair to say.
And I feel one of the areas where I sort of hop off the left-wing train is that there is this notion that human beings today are somehow different than they were 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago. Whereas I think, no way, we're still the same monkey. We just have interesting clothes and we've got all this sort of cool technology going on, and the basic psychology hasn't changed at all, and those core things about our lives, about community and family and values and the search for meaning and purpose, that's never changed.
100% agree on that.
And will probably never change. And the way that people in this part of the world who call themselves Israelites or whatever, or Judeans, the way that they interpreted the best way forward in all those areas of life is very similar. it's more similar to what Jews do now than any other people in the world. Come on, man, give me that.
I guess maybe I would ask you to rephrase that, because just to make
How
sure.
would you say it? Yeah.
Well, look, until the 19th century, the idea that a Jew in Poland or North Africa would pack up their bags and move to Israel permanently, for many, if not most Jews in the diaspora, would have been heresy. Because, as you probably well know, the traditional view, the traditional halachic view, based on, Rashi is probably the first and foremost person who's cited when when Jews talk about the coming of the Mashiach. But the idea that a Jew would take action to pull forward the future, and move to Israel to try and bring about the coming of the Messiah, that was totally against halakha for many, many centuries. Okay. The traditional rabbinical establishment said it's God decides when the Mashiach comes, not people. And by moving to Israel, you're actually trying to play God's role. And as you well know, Judaism is extremely hostile to anyone believing they're a God-like person.
Sure.
And so the idea that you would promote migration to Israel is basically saying better than God when the Messiah is going to come. So that was heresy. Jews killed each other for that over the years. I mean, Shabtai Tzvi, this idea that we should move to the Holy Land and try and bring about the coming of the Mashiach, this was heresy.
First, let's just say I agree with all that. I still don't see how that nullifies my simple point that, for example, in the Torah it says there's an injunction to honor the Shabbat, right? For a very interesting reason, because God on Saturday said, "Fuck it, I'm done," right? People do that today. Now, they don't do it exactly the same way. They have silly things with elevators and flipping on light switches, which that consideration didn't exist thousands of years ago. But the idea of setting apart one day of the week is just a very simple thing, but it's a very profound thing, and it's reoccurring, and it's just an essential part of life that, again, you can take this in any context you want. Like if the Muslims say, I think their special day is Friday, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. If you go back, 1,400 years, there were people who decided Friday is a special day. We go to the mosque, right? Even the act of praying 5 times a day is something that for hundreds of years, Muslims have been doing the same, right? So there is this through line that crosses for Muslims. You would agree, right?
Totally. I mean,
the same is true for Jews, and the same I think would for any religion, right?
Yeah, I mean, totally. I mean, there's certain elements of the religion, certain rituals that are very old, and there is quite a nice through line from the ancient. I mean, not the ancient world, but for many, many, many centuries, let's say.
Yeah. That
you can kind of draw a straight line from there to here.
Sure.
Totally agree on that.
Okay. Good. Oh man. But what I and maybe this is just me holding a high standard, but what troubles me about the Palestinian identity or movement or what is it? And place-based identity.
Very good.
Is that it lacks this cohesiveness, and I don't say that as a finger wagging Jew who lives in Israel. I say that as someone who thinks this is part of the problem, is that clearly we have a society that is fractured and doesn't really know itself, because you've got an Islamist wing and there's no Christian version of Palestinian politics or Palestinian identity. I know there are obviously such a thing as Palestinian Christians. And then you've got a communist wing, and it's just this, we'll just grab ideas from all over the place, and none of it makes any sense, and they don't really cohere with one another. And it's no surprise that this society is so divided. Now, I know you might counter and say that, well, also the Israelis are to blame. And sure. But having a unified story is super powerful. And it's super useful.
Yeah.
And it's hard to end a conflict if one of the sides is in conflict with itself or doesn't even know itself.
Yeah, well, in the context of the current political environment in this country, I think it's ironic what you're saying. But
yeah, no.
But
by the way, that's a great point, and I agree with you that the Israelis don't know what the fuck they're doing. They don't know who they are.
But there's no question that Palestinians have really suffered from a tremendous amount of infighting and factionalism going back long before the establishment of the state of Israel in 1948. Mm-hmm. Already in the 1920s, Palestinians were divided into two clans, the Husseinis and the Nashashibis, and they were bitter rivals. And by the way, like it's worth pointing out that the British played an active role in creating that division. Yeah. The British appointed Haj Amin al-Husseini, a kind of a nobody in 1920. He appointed him as the Grand Mufti, a position which the British itself invented in order to create a wedge between Muslims and Christians, to have them focus on their religious rather than their national identity. Mm-hmm. I mean, this was an active. I mean, British did this everywhere, right? They did it in India. Yeah. They divide and conquer. This is a classic colonial strategy for dividing the local population and making it harder for them to resist colonial rule. So this was something that you find in Palestinian society already from the 1920s. And then I think by the 1930s, really the key divide was the urban-rural divide. Palestinian society, even going back into the late Ottoman Empire, was incredibly divided between the urban and the rural, populations. Urban populations.
What are they divided about?
Well, urban populations, oftentimes were wealthier. They were the landlords. Remember, going back to the late Ottoman period, the Ottoman Empire privatized property in 1858. Okay, the Ottoman Land Law of 1858. Okay. Introduced private property into the Ottoman Empire, and so all these effendis, these city dwellers who had influence, they were able to basically go up and buy up all of this land because the peasants were unwilling to register in their name out of fear that they would get conscripted and that they would get taxed. And so these effendis bought up all this land, which then created kind of a new divide in Palestinian society between the landowning elite and the landless peasantry, which obviously played out during the Mandate period in the 20s and 30s, when all of these landlords started selling land to Zionists, who then showed up to the land and displaced the peasants working the land who didn't own the land, and so they got displaced. So that created even more tension within Palestinian society. That you had these landlords who owned all this land, but it was the Palestinian, and the landlords got wealthy selling the land, whereas the Palestinians got displaced when the land was sold. So this incredible divide emerged and entrenched itself. And I think the tipping point, the peak, was really during the Great Revolt from 1936 to 1939, when you had more Palestinian Arabs killed by other Palestinian Arabs than you did by the British or the Zionists.
Wait, what? So
between 1936 and 1939, you had a massive revolt in Palestine, one of the biggest anti-colonial revolts anywhere in the world at the time. Okay. Palestinians were fed up with Zionist immigration. They were fed up with Zionist land purchases. They were getting displaced, and they revolted. And so starting in 1936, we're talking strikes, we're talking protests, we're talking assassinations. Palestinians revolted against the British and against the Zionists. In order to rid themselves of the colonial yoke and rid themselves of this Zionist population trying to take over the country. Okay. And so, but of course, one of the key but there was a tremendous amount of infighting within Palestinian society during the revolt, especially between the rural peasants and the city dwellers, the landlords, the effendis. So, again, Palestinian society has been.
Wait, but who was doing the killing? You said that more Arabs killed each other than
correct
than the Jews or the British did.
Different rival Palestinian factions
killed each other.
Correct.
Why?
Yeah, it's a great. I'm agreeing with your earlier point about the divisions within Palestinian society. Palestinian nationalists might not like to admit this, right? Because as a nationalist, you want to always portray your people as united, but the reality is quite different. And of course, I mean, the problem.
Why were Palestinian Arabs killing each other during the Great Revolt? That's crazy.
I mean, Palestinian politics, especially during the Mandate period, were vicious. I mean, rival clans, competing for one another. Look, there were a few reasons for the violence. I think number one would be that there was this question of basically how pro British we should be. Some Palestinians were basically like, you know what, we should accommodate the British. We're willing to accept positions within the British mandatory government. We're even willing to maybe tolerate this some amount of Zionist immigration, but we just want to limit it. So that was sort of, let's say, one side of the spectrum. The other side of the spectrum was these colonizers. They are usurping our country. They're handing the country over to people that want nothing but our removal from the country. So you had this divide within Palestinian society around how pro-British or how anti-British you should be.
And that was based on economic lines, so that the city dwellers were against the peasant class, or not necessarily.
That's a good question, actually. I wouldn't necessarily. I wouldn't put it that way. No, I think you had both urban and city dwellers on both sides of that issue.
Okay. It's interesting also that even when the landowning class started selling to the Zionists, that that they sold the land, which is you would think, why would they sell their property to people who have nationalistic ambition? Is a very interesting question to already to consider, and then for the people who are working the land, that is their livelihood. That is their identity. Like, that is their day to day. They wake up and they till this land, and so I could see why the peasant class would be resentful of this new these whatever you want to call them, these new residents.
There was a lot of hostility and anger towards Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti. Oh, yeah? He was a hated person
this among is the Nazi dude, right?
Yeah, I love it how there's probably the single most famous photo, Palestinian photo of a Palestinian before 1948 is going to be to an average Israeli or an average Jew is going to be the photo with Haj Amin al-Husseini standing next to Adolf Hitler. 100% same guy. So it's interesting to talk about why that Israelis absolutely love that episode. I mean, it's literally like you'd think all Palestinians were Nazis if you didn't know any better.
No, I didn't say that.
No, I know, but there's certainly. By the way, I mean, there's plenty of Jews and Zionists that had alliances with the Nazis as well. So
plenty.
Oh yeah,
come on, man.
I mean, look, there's a deep, dark underbelly of Zionist history, which is that Christian anti-Semites were some of the earliest Zionists. Rid Europe of the Jews. This was a very anti-Semitic idea.
Sure.
Zionism found a comfortable place in the homes of a huge number of anti-Semitic Europeans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and look, that alliance continued well into the 1930s. So
you could even argue that it's still kind of strong today.
The number one the Israel's strongest supporters in the U.S. evangelical Christians. Guess what they believe? They have, again, I have to be careful when I'm speaking in terms of generalities, but we're talking many millions, if not tens of millions of Americans harbor deep anti-Semitic beliefs about the Jews. That's why they're Zionists, because they want Jews to move to Israel, such that this will bring about the second coming of Christ. And when that happens, all Jews are going to die a horrible, painful, miserable death. I mean, how is that not anti-Semitic?
Well, it has a happy ending. The rapture sounds great, so I don't blame them.
So I don't know how we got off on this tangent, but what we were talking about earlier was like there was
a lot of resentment towards Haj Amin.
Yeah, because Haj Amin al-Husseini concentrated power around himself. It was not
just
a great.
Actually, give for anyone that doesn't know. I mean, give a brief. Who is this guy?
Yeah, so this guy comes from a very prominent family from Jerusalem. He's kind of a nobody when he first gets appointed as the leader of the Supreme Muslim Council, and that was by intention, right?
Who did the appointing here?
The British.
Oh.
Right, so British, they conquer Palestine in 1917, 1918. Their British mandate for Palestine gets ratified by the League of Nations in 1922, and so they introduce all these new positions, right? Again, for the purpose of dividing the Palestinians between Muslims and Christians. That was basically the goal.
Okay.
And so that if the Muslims see themselves as Muslims and the Christians see themselves as Christians, they'll see themselves primarily according to their religious identities rather than their national identities, which is of course the last thing the British want, because the British are worried throughout the 1920s and 1930s and 40s of arousing the national awakening of the Palestinian people. And in fact, they're actually explicit about this, and they even, like, for example, try and limit the number of Palestinian high schools, because obviously you educate these kids, you give them an education, they're gonna get awoken, their nationalist sentiments are gonna be awoken.
Okay.
And so the British were very much so is they appoint this guy who's but he's kind of a young guy, he kind of a nobody, again, for the same purpose, to create division among the Palestinian population.
Okay.
And he gets appointed Supreme Muslim Counselor, and apparently and the anecdotes are that he's arrogant, and that he doesn't share power, and that he concentrates and amasses as much power around himself. And so this creates a tremendous amount of resentment among the other Palestinian faction. Like I said,
because he didn't deserve it. He was given it to him by an external force, and he was an asshole.
Exactly.
Okay.
So this was another point of tension within Palestinian society in the mandate. These are things Palestinians don't know much about, and by the way, don't like to talk about either, because nobody likes to talk. Do you think the Zionists like to talk about the Atlantis affair, where you have a ship of Lehi and Stern gang members arriving in Tel Aviv and Jaffa, and was it 1946, and they have to sink the ship, and I believe some number of I don't know this history super well, but the Zionists don't like to talk about the tension within the Yishuv either.
They have museums dedicated to this shit. Listen to me, man. I live in Tel Aviv, like a 5-minute walk from the beach, and there's just monuments dedicated to all this stuff, all this history. You know why? Because they united and they won.
Look, I think there's something to be said.
If you have succeeded as much as the Jews, the Zionists, whatever you want to call the Israelis have, there's no shame in your history anymore.
I think there is something to be said for the unity of the Jewish people historically. I think being a persecuted minority for so many centuries, and I think being a minority in Palestine for so many decades, forced the community to unite around shared values and shared interests. It's much harder to unite as a majority. I think that's the case everywhere, by the way. I don't think there's anything special about Palestine in during the mandate period in that respect. I think minority groups, owing to their positions in societies as minorities, are sort of naturally better placed to unite.
So let me give a argument against that. So, for example, in Gaza, people have united under the threat of force, but also think through their own free will, and in a sense, under the banner of Islamist politics. And most polls show that if there was a free and fair election, that Hamas would win and they would take control over everything, which is interesting given this distinction by let's say the British, even, that they were trying to make a distinction between religious identity and national identity, and the fact that Islam resonates so much more to a population that is, for the most part, Islamic, right? So it's 90-something% Muslim.
Yeah, probably 85% Muslim.
85, okay. This idea of building a country around more or less like the Jewish state, right? A set of ideas that goes back, traces its origins back for many, many years, and you can even, as a Muslim today, identify with that same practice for hundreds or even thousands of years, 1,400 years. That resonates far more than some hodgepodge of ideas, very ill-defined. Like, I actually read the PLO charter, And okay, look, you could say even for in the Declaration of Independence for the Americans, there is no outline of what the country is. It's just so here are our grievances, and we have this idea that all men are created equal, and here is like the tail end of the document is basically the king fucked us over in X, Y, Z ways, and we say, okay, you rule over us no more, and that's it. Right? There are a bunch of signatures. A PLO document is kind of the same. So I cut it some slack, but it's been, we're talking now, when was the PLO formed? In the early 60s? It's been now 60 years, and there's still not to my eye, maybe you disagree, but not a coherent vision of what a Palestinian state would be other than, I think, the Hamas, which is, look, we have a set of laws and a way of life that is Islamic, and we think this is good, and this is what's best for our people. That I can understand. Like there's an actual constructive vision there. I respect that far more than this sort of vague.
Yeah, I think Israel has played a key role in dividing and conquering the Palestinians for 75 years.
Yeah,
right.
So still have a vision of like what is this country that we as a collective group of people should aspire to build, because I think that. This is my suspicion, and again, tell me if you disagree, but that the Palestinian national movement, setting aside some part of the Islamist wing, is about resentment and grievance rather than building something special and something that is united around a shared value for Palestinian people. And I wish I heard that more than the Jews fucked us over and the Zionists this and the occupiers, which is true. Okay, I don't think that should be not part of the story. But there has to be a day too where the Palestinian country rises from the ground and turns into something that is aspirational,
Yeah, I think.
And uplifting.
If it would be sort of like someone who's, on the ground has someone had a soldier is holding their boot over their neck and be like, well, how come you're always complaining about occupation and oppression, and aren't talking about the vision that you have for your own state? I mean, I think when you're when you're in a position of power, it's easy to have a vision. When you're in a position of a powerlessness, you do tend to obsess over how do we rid ourselves of this oppression. But I think that's natural.
But Hamas has a vision. They have a plan.
So is Fatah.
And you talk about having a boot around your neck. They're literally blockaded by Israel and Egypt. They're what's the popular term that everyone uses is an open air prison. And yet they, even before they came to power, had this idea that, okay, obviously they borrowed from the Muslim Brotherhood, but still they had this idea. They took the time to develop a vision for the country. Like it, don't like it, whatever. Why can't we have something that isn't as genocidal as those guys?
Look, I think the PLO has had a vision for many decades. It's to create an independent Palestinian state in all of historic Palestine.
Based on what? Like, what does that look like? That's where I'm drawing a blank. I like, for example, like Peter Beinart, he says we should have a binational state. I'm like, great. Well, what does that look like? What's the official language?
How would it look different than a Jewish state?
I don't care if different or not. Like, just present to me the picture in your mind. No, obviously it doesn't have to be high resolution. The banks are going to be here and the movie theaters are going to be not like that. But it's just like, what is it, right? And it's too vague. It's too and so when you rightly criticize me for saying how easy it is for me standing in my comfort to criticize other people who are obsessing about their own oppression. True. But if you're only obsessing about your own oppression, you're not going anywhere. Not going anywhere constructive.
Yeah, I think getting back to this question around unity, I think where Palestinians do find unity, a unity in voice and expression, is around rejecting occupation and apartheid and siege. What Palestinian is going to disagree with that?
Zero.
Whereas when you start to talk about solutions, one state, two state, three state, binational state, I mean, there's any number of solutions, right? But
but that's a problem.
Look, I think when you focus on, I think for Palestinians, focusing on rights has now become more of a rallying call. Focusing about the right of return, focusing about political rights, focusing about freedom of movement, the right to wave a Palestinian flag, right? The right, just basic rights,
Sure.
I think those things are you're going to find a tremendous amount of consensus around those issues.
Okay.
Find me a Palestinian anywhere in historic Palestine, really anywhere else that doesn't believe Palestinians should have a right to return. I mean, that's essentially unanimous. So I think it's much, and by the way, that is a vision. That is a vision.
But return to what, I think, is the question.
Right? Like,
that's I keep insisting on. Let's say we grant all this, right? Whatever's on the wish list, to correct for the justifiable grievances that have occurred that Palestinian people hold. Great. We correct for those things in whichever way that they please. And then what? What does this country look like afterwards? Because we have two people here, and neither one of them seems intent on getting the fuck out of here en masse. So we have to live together, right? And so how do we do that?
I would rather like ground ourselves in real world situations and try and actually think through how we get from where we are here to where we want to get to there, rather than try and kind of come up with sort of like a blue sky, pull a rabbit out of a hat. Like, let's just imagine what a beautiful world would look like. No, let's actually ask ourselves, how do we get from where we are now to where we want to be? I think.
What's the difference, though? Where we want to be.
Well, it's just a more practical way of thinking through like a potential solution or a future outcome.
Great.
Because like trying to actually walk through like literally where we are now, which is a situation in which you have the most right-wing government in all of Israeli history. Mm-hmm. You have Smotrich and Ben Gvir essentially annexing many parts of the West Bank as we speak. It's like literally happening, in real time. Mm-hmm. You have Gaza is essentially unlivable. 50% of people live below the poverty line. So how do we go from this situation to where we want to be? In my view, I think let's first talk about the West Bank, and then we can deal with Gaza after, because these are different situations right now.
Okay.
I think
I don't see it that way, but go on.
Fair point. We can talk about that, but I think in the West Bank, I think there's like two things that could happen in the West Bank, and I think it's up to Palestinians to decide which trend wins out. Mm-hmm. Right now, we're witnessing a militant trend, a return to violence, and that has been the case for now, the past 2 years, let's say. Kind of a resurgence of violent resistance and a retreat of nonviolent resistance.
Can I just interject one bit for a second there? That, to me, feels like evidence for people who are lacking any hopeful future.
It's definitely evidence that there's a tremendous amount of hopelessness.
Which is then, for me, bolsters my point that people need a positive vision for the future. You need a reason to wake up in the morning and say, we are throwing off our oppressors to build
But I think the resistance gives people that hope.
Yes, I agree with you. It's just not workable.
Well, there's no question that violent resistance against one of the most powerful armies in the world, with the most advanced technological surveillance attack in the world, is obviously not going to succeed.
It's pathetic.
I mean, it's failed for decades.
Yeah.
So clearly,
I've been watching Gandhi the movie, and it's just like, man, that guy's a gangster, and he didn't fire a single bullet. That's crazy. Where's my Palestinian Gandhi? Where's my Palestinian Mandela? No, really.
Well, it's called BDS. It's not one person, it's a whole movement. Okay. It's actually better than a person, because a person can die, but a movement lives on. So we do have it. It's called Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, and it's a 18-year long movement that has gotten dozens and dozens of institutions and churches and universities around the world to embrace its principles. For decades now, we've had nonviolent protests, protesting the wall, protesting occupation, protesting siege. I mean, we have a lot of nonviolent resistance. Back in 2018, 2019, Palestinians in Gaza marched to the wall to claim their right of return in historic Palestine. Guess what happened? 56 of them were shot. They were murdered. I mean, they were protesting and they were shot by snipers. So, nonviolent resistance hasn't worked all that well either. Both because Israel, treats anyone who is a BDS supporter as a criminal and tries to criminalize it in the United States. In fact, there's in many states in the United States and the US, it's illegal, for example, to boycott a company that is profiting off the Israeli occupation. They're passing laws making that illegal. They're criminalizing it. So, my question to you would be, you're asking me, where's the Palestinian Gandhi? Well, if Israelis and Jews really want a Palestinian Gandhi, why are they criminalizing it? Shouldn't they be promoting it and being like, look, we support you guys. This is a nonviolent form of resistance. But they're not doing that. They don't want any resistance, nonviolent or violent. It doesn't make a difference for Israel. Anyone that stands in the way of Israel's continual entrenchment of its control over the West Bank is an obstacle. And certainly with the current government, but certainly, as well as long before the current government, that's been the case.
Sure. Yeah. I would say that the current government is more right-wing than most. I still think that...
you had ISM activists already, this is going back 20 years. We were protesting in Belain and Nelain and Nebi Saleh. We're talking 15, 20 years ago. We were, if you were caught at a you're waving a flag, you're chanting Free Palestine, you get arrested for that. Bassem Abu Rahma was shot in the chest with a tear gas canister for waving a Palestinian flag. I mean, that's what happens when you protest non-violently. You get killed. So when people see that, they're like, okay, well, at least if I pick up a gun, then I have a chance. And I'm not justifying that. I'm just trying to understand the mentality.
Sure.
So,
yeah. Listen, I don't know. I don't know. I have to take your word for it. If that's
so
the
kind
case,
of backing up, kind of getting back to what's the future look like for the West Bank? I do think that, Palestinians can take the violent route and they can take the nonviolent route, and there will always be people who take both.
Yeah.
And there's nothing you or I or anyone else can do to change that. But I do think that ultimately the nonviolent route leads to a place where Palestinians will just demand, civil rights inside Israel, an Israeli passport. Be like, look, it's pretty obvious that there's no plausible way in which Israel would ever grant a Palestinian state sovereignty, real sovereignty. I mean, that's never going to happen, right? For decades now, Israel has, fortified its positions on the Jordanian border. I mean, going all the way back to the Alon Plan in 1967, all the way, there's a very clear through line here, which is Israel wants to maintain control of the Jordan Valley because it wants to be able to encircle the Palestinians. It wants to maintain control over that border with Jordan. Mm-hmm. And not just that border. It wants to retain the major settlement blocks. Even the most generous offer, Ehud Barak's 2000 offer at Taba, the most generous position. I mean, maybe even Olmert went even further, you could say. But basically, the most generous positions maintained Israeli military presence in the West Bank. Multiple outposts, control over the settlement blocks, an ability to divide the West Bank into 8 different parts if Israel wants to, control over the Jordan Valley. No Palestinian leader is ever going to be able to accept that. So there's no hope, even in the most optimistic world. Let's go back to before the Second Intifada, before things really spiraled out of control, before 55% of Israelis are voting for Ben Gvir and Smotrich. Before all that, it was still impossible. And now
wait, what? 55% are voting for?
I mean, right? If you had to say, basically, what percent of Israelis today vote for right-wing parties?
Yeah,
it's well over 50%.
It's 80%. The whole country is right-wing.
Okay, I mean, I don't disagree with you. But
the left is dead.
You're 100% correct about that. Yeah. But I'm just saying, even before the left was dead, there was no real hope for any kind of rapprochement because there was just too much distance between the sides. We haven't even brought up Jerusalem, the refugees yet. We're trying to talk about sovereignty, and we haven't even gotten to the real core of the issues, which is Jerusalem and refugees. Yeah. We're just trying to figure out where to draw the line, and even that is, there's just too much distance between the two sides.
Right.
So the idea that there's going to be some, peaceful two-state solution is obviously a total pipe dream. And so then once Palestinians realize that and they say, okay, well, we can't have our own state. What do we want? Do we want a Bantustan with, the right to collect the garbage and to police the streets, and to offer healthcare services? even though we don't actually have the freedom to move, we don't have freedom of movement. We're not allowed to travel abroad without Israeli permission. We're not allowed to go to Gaza without Israeli permission. We're not allowed to go to the sea without Israeli permission. Like, are they going to accept that? And I think the answer is obviously not.
Right.
And so then will they accept a Bantustan? And that's essentially the status quo, is like basically this sort of liminal sovereignty in 15-20% of the West Bank and Area A, and like basically no sovereignty in the rest of it. And even within the areas that they have quote unquote sovereignty, they actually, the Israeli military conducts raids on a daily basis, so they don't even have sovereignty there. It's like, I can't see Palestinians really believing long term that they want that. And so if they don't want that, and they know two-state solution is impossible to have a real sovereignty, then what's left? Israeli citizenship. And so I think ultimately, if I had to predict where Palestinian activism and human rights activism is going to evolve in the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years, you will eventually, I think, see a movement within Palestinian society for Israeli citizenship. Just make us citizens, give us equality, enough with the occupation. Just, you've already basically annexed the territory. Just make us equals inside of it.
Right.
So, you look, that's one. I mean, that's sort of I think that's kind of best case scenario, right? I think, or West Bank could turn into Gaza, right? I mean, this is not, you could easily see this happening, right? Yeah. What if Mahmoud Abbas dies tomorrow? Yeah. And there's free and some number 2 gets appointed and decides to hold free and fair elections, and Hamas wins in the West Bank. You would expect that to happen, I think. Mm-hmm. And then Israel does what to the West Bank what it did to Gaza. And then you just have these, and things just get worse and worse and worse. And now 50% of West Bankers are also living below the poverty line. So I mean, that's another possible outcome. I really hope that doesn't happen.
Right.
But
that's pretty.
But it's like that could.
Hopeless.
So I think the West Bank. I'm optimistic. I think there are reasons to be pessimistic. We don't know. It's for Palestinians to decide. Now, in the case of Gaza, I mean, I think I'm definitely less hopeful. How can you be hopeful in 8 wars in 12 years? I mean, 90% of people don't have access to fresh drinking water. 50% of people live below the poverty line. I mean, it's an open air prison, and it's just getting worse. Things are not. Maybe there's peaks and troughs, and maybe we're in a little bit of a peak right now. As Israel is now actually letting in some number of tens of thousands of Palestinians from Gaza to work in Israel. But
what do you do if you're Israel and there's an openly hostile regime that as you said yourself, that the military odds favor heavily Israel, and yet these people insist on not addressing the acute economic and public health issues that are plaguing the country, rather insisting on fighting their neighbors. And I'm not saying there's a perfect answer to this, because as you said, the occupation is real. But Jesus, man, this is not responsible when you're talking about that many people living under those conditions.
Obviously, I completely agree with you. That the situation's dire, and Hamas is not helping the matter. I'm no fan of Hamas. I support democracy. Hamas is not a democratic government. It's actually anti-democratic. There were no elections held when Anwar, Sinwar, was promoted as Gaza's number 1 leader in Gaza. Look, I would say going back many decades, the state of Israel regarded the PLO the same way the state of Israel today regards Hamas, right? So this idea that, an organization can't evolve, I think is obviously proven false by history. I think in the 1970s, the PLO was considered the violent terrorist organization, and actually it was Israel that helped establish Hamas to provide a counterweight to those crazy terrorists. Hamas was actually originally funded by Israel. And then, of course, that things obviously changed after the first Intifada. But I don't see any reason why there can't be some kind of rapprochement between Israel and Hamas. I mean, in fact, you even have Israeli leaders basically saying, the PA is an asset, Hamas is a liability. Excuse me. The PA is a liability.
Right.
Hamas is an asset. Why is Hamas an asset? Well, because every time they send rockets into Israel, the entire international community condemns them for, indiscriminately targeting civilian populations. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, what a great asset to have on your southern border as a country who is in constant, being constantly attacked on the international stage. So, yeah, what a great asset is Hamas. Completely agree on that for the state of Israel. I think kind of a rapprochement between Israel and Hamas would actually make things harder on Israel. It would make things much harder for them to sort of claim that, we need to operate this securitized state and, put 600 checkpoints in the West Bank and, demolish hundreds, if not thousands of Palestinian homes every year. It would be harder for Israel to do those things if it weren't for Hamas. Now, so I think, and by the way, I think actually Hamas has been open to negotiations with Israel for more than a decade now. It was, I believe, Khalid Meshal who said, who they offered a 10-year hudna, a 10-year truce already, back in 2006, 2007.
Yeah,
so,
but what kind of a responsible leader would take up that offer? Like your enemy says to you, listen, we'll stop killing you for 10 years, and then after we'll talk again. What the fuck, man? That's not a deal. That's just...
Well...
It's where we are right now.
I mean, look, that was the same... I mean, the Iran nuclear negotiations were the same thing. I think it was like a 10-year process, right? So, or some kind of deal that was in place for 10 years. So when talking about like international treaties, I think 10 years is quite a long time.
No, I know, but the basic physics is the same. Like, what are you going to say to Hamas? Okay, in those 10 years, we expect you to not want the entire land for yourselves, and... in the case that you do take over, make this in an Islamic country. I mean, that is their whole entire.
Look, I think a lot of things have to happen within Israeli society for there ever to be a rapprochement. I think Israelis need to acknowledge that. They need to acknowledge 48. They need to openly teach about the Nakba in Israeli schools.
You think Israelis are ignorant about the history? I mean, Benny Morris. I mean, all these historians who.
Well,
there's quite a lot of stuff being written. And
maybe they're aware. Maybe most Israelis, you could say, are aware of what happened.
Yeah.
But they would say it's justified. They would say that, well, they tried to kill us, so too bad for them, right? They would justify the ethnic cleansing, right? Even though you're right, they are, most of them probably aware of it at this point. Although there's still plenty of propaganda that circulates, and Israelis are not really taught about what actually happened in 48 in high schools. It's not part of the Israeli curriculum. In fact, I mean, if anything, they're taught misinformation, right? That Palestinians left on their own, that they were told by their leaders to leave, which is for the most part misinformation. No, they were expelled and not allowed back, and anyone who tried to come back was shot at. And I think if Israelis can come to acknowledge that, shooting at refugees returning to their homes after the war is unethical, and we made a mistake, and we want to do what we can now to account for that, or...
What do you mean by unethical? A war that didn't start?
Well, if my grandfather wanted to return to Poland after World War II, I think it would have been unethical for the Polish military to shoot at him if he tried to enter the country.
You said the war was unethical, that the Israelis started.
What I'm saying is it's unethical to prevent a refugee from returning to their home after a war.
Uh-huh. Got it. Okay.
A refugee who, so I think there has to be some acknowledgement of that. I think without Israelis acknowledging that they've committed these wrongdoings, it's going to be very hard, I think, for Palestinians, to come to accept them, to come to kind of terms with the state of Israel. I think there has to be acknowledgement. It's so critical for me. This acknowledgement that, this state was born in sin, and we can't undo that, but we can acknowledge it. And that means a tremendous amount. And then once you acknowledge it, it's like, that's step one. Mm-hmm. But we haven't even, it's like, we're so far from even getting to step one. Like, you're telling me, how do we get to step 8? I'm like, let's just start with step 1. It's like, so, these things are not easy. These take decades to change. I mean, look, I mean, the civil rights movement in the U.S., we had the Civil Rights Act was in 1965. George Floyd was 2020. Like, it took 60, 70 years, and there's still a lot of racism in the U.S. We haven't even gotten to 1965. We're still in the apartheid era. We're still in the Jim Crow era.
Come on, man.
With Palestinians in the West Bank.
Oh, okay. I thought you were talking about
no, we're like 1930s. We're a century. I mean, really. I mean, if you think about civil rights struggles, they take centuries.
I mean, this is not, I would argue, not comparable, because we're talking about two distinct national movements.
Maybe the better parallel would really be the indigenous populations of the United States who were pushed onto reservations, just like the Palestinians are pushed into Area A.
Yeah.
And then, they're confined into small spaces and, not allowed to leave and not allowed to, they lost access to their land and their means of livelihood. That's probably the better analogy. But look, now we live in a society where, of course, Native Americans are, have some of the highest infant mortality rates in the United States. And they're some of the most, underprivileged and poverty-stricken people in the United States. But there's still an acknowledgement within the United States that, like, my God, look at these horrible things that we did.
Yeah.
And there's an attempt to try and, first it's an acknowledgement. And then it's like, okay, well, what can we do? How can we, make up for the sins of the past?
I think that I agree with so much of what you said. I still think that despite the fact that it's difficult, it doesn't mean that people can't take the responsibility for themselves to say, we have to find a more hopeful vision for the future. Now, if that source of hope is jihadism, that's a start, but it's not a very fruitful way of looking at things. And just because it's hard, and just because you're under occupation, life is brutal, and you don't get to escape your responsibility as an active agent in the world. And again, it's super easy for me to say, and it's, but I don't think that that's that we can escape that. And I wish that there was more discussion about that. Now, as you said, right, the conversation shifting more towards civil rights and being full citizens of Israel is appealing on the one hand, but also just completely a non-starter for obvious reasons. That because again, it's like, okay, it's the binational state. Well, what does that state look like? What are those national symbols? What do they look like? Do we continue as is in Israel? Do these people serve in the military? Like what? And there's just, it creates far more problems than it solves, I think. And I wish I had the answers.
Look, I think Hutus and Tutsis are able to live together post-genocide in Rwanda.
Yeah.
I think Arabs and Nubians are able to live together in Egypt. Blacks and whites live together in the United States. Turks and Germans live together in Germany. This idea that people of different religions or different ethnicities are going to be at war forever, I just fundamentally don't agree with that.
Sure.
I think we already see within Israel, Jews and Arabs are living together just fine. There's no problem with Jews living together with Arabs. Whether or not, West Bank Palestinians serve in the military, I mean, this is a detail. This is somewhat of a footnote. I mean, by the way, Orthodox Jews don't even serve in the military. Like, there's all kinds of exemptions made for everyone. Like, I think this is a footnote. I think especially these days with the divisions inside of Israel having never been, more prominent and more acerbic than they are now. Mm-hmm. I think it's hard for you to say, well, there's no world in which West Bank couldn't really just be part of Israel. I mean, obviously it could be. And I think it will be. And I think inevitably that is what will happen, because Palestinians aren't going to want Bantustan state. There's no chance of a real state ever coming to fruition. And I hope that they reject violent resistance, because that will just lead them to a place where Gaza is right now, which is total impoverishment, you think closure is bad now? Wait till you start, like committing even more violent attacks. You're gonna have even more. The securitized state will clamp down even harder on you. It's just, for every one Jew that Palestinians kill, Israelis going to go and kill 100 Palestinians, and that's just the numbers of the conflict. So right. It's just they had value your life much, 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 much less, and they value their own. So they're willing to inflict tremendous damage and loss of life on the Palestinian side, because they can, and they're willing to. So I just don't see violence really going anywhere. And so what's left? It's just like, give us a passport. Just let us vote in elections. And I think, as soon as that happens, I do think we'll see a remarkable shift inside Israel. Like, I think, I would hope Israelis sort of realize like, wow, there's light at the end of the tunnel here. We don't have to be at war forever.
I kind of want to end this in a really bitter note, which is you on social media. It's a blast following your fights with you're just constantly getting into fights with people. I saw you got into a fight with this guy Yosef Haddad.
That's right.
Yeah.
Look, this guy's just spewing misinformation. So I mean,
but Yosef Haddad he's a Christian Arab, right? I think he's Christian.
Honestly, I don't know.
He served in the military in Israel, and he's sort of made a name for himself as a guy online who is super pro-Israel. And I don't know how you guys got entangled on Twitter, but what happened?
Well, he's just tweeting misinformation, which coincidentally happened to be the misinformation I debunked in my PhD dissertation. And so, yeah, I chimed in. He wrote something to the effect of no one identified as Palestinian before the PLO and Yasser Arafat in the 1960s.
Right.
Which is just patently false. Like, that was literally, I wrote, 300 pages on that question. Like, what do you mean? Like, you're just spewing misinformation. So, yeah, I sort of chimed in.
He's actually not the first Arab I've heard make that point in Israel.
Look, throughout the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, there were many Arabs in Palestine. It was a minority view, but it was a view nonetheless, that there was no such thing as Palestine, that there were no such thing as Palestinians, that we were all part of Syria.
Right.
In fact, Palestine was actually called Southern Syria. Out of this belief, and it really got going from the brief 2-year period when there was an independent Syrian kingdom based out of Damascus from 1918 to 1920, and Palestinians in 1918, 1919, and 1920 sought unity with that government. Better to be ruled by a semi-independent Arab kingdom from Damascus than British military regime that had just announced the Balfour Declaration to encourage Zionist immigration and Zionist land purchases in Palestine. So because of that desire to unite with Syria in that 1918 to 1920 period, throughout the decades that followed, there was this kind of nostalgia for this desire to sort of unite with Syria, reject the colonial divisions. Palestine, Syria we were all Bilad Sham before the colonizers came and divided us up into 4 countries. So there's this sort of nostalgia for some imagined history of unity among all peoples in the greater Syria, Bilad Sham. So that was that trend.
Why do you say imagined history?
Well, when was there ever actually a state based in Bilad Sham that ruled over the lands of Sham, what is today Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Israel, Palestine? It was imagined. That never existed, really. It was part of the Ottoman Empire. It was an Ottoman state. There were, Muslim states before that. There was Ayyubid states. There were Mamluk states. There were Ottoman states. But this idea that there was this state based in Bilad Sham was a modern invention. I mean, that's a 20th century idea. So, anyways, you had all these Arabs during the Mandate period. Even beyond, right, going into the 50s and 60s, basically saying, "Oh, we're part of Syria." This is a minority view. Mm. And anyways, by the reason they wanted unity with Syria was because was out of their a desire to prevent Palestine from being taken over by British supporting Zionists, Zionists supporting British colonizers, right? It was their desire to protect Palestine from Zionist immigration and Zionist land purchases that they sought unity with Syria. So out of their love for Palestine, they wanted to be united with Syria, which is then used by Zionists to claim they never cared about Palestine.
Okay.
So that's its own history, which we didn't really get into much. But yes, of course, there are always going to be people who say, "Oh, I'm Syrian. You know, I'm Arab. I'm Palestinian. I'm Syrian." You're going to find everything. But basically, this guy Yusuf Haddad came out with this tweet that was something to the effect of, "There was no such thing as Palestinians before 1960s," and which is just patently false, as I said. And so I was like, turns out that's a fiction. You're just spreading misinformation. And because I'd already tweeted out these threads before. Like, I've already shared all the research. All I had to do was paste a link to the thread where I already documented the 114 instances of the word Philistini from 1898 to 1914.
114?
114.
What? It's just such a precise number.
Maybe it's 123. I forget the exact number. We'll drop a link in the description to the paper, yeah. Which has the correct count.
Okay.
But it's just nonsense. It's just like, well, I don't. And then people attack me like, who are you to tell a Palestinian about the origins? And I'm like, it doesn't really matter whether you're Palestinian or Syrian or Lebanese or Ashkenazi American Jewish. Like, that doesn't really matter here. We're talking about historical facts. Like,
sure.
You know,
but those historical facts can be parsed in a way that suits a view or doesn't. Like, for example, when we were first talking, you said that dude, the British guy, he wrote the memoir and he was saying that these are the Palestinians. He is imposing something on people that either have no idea what he's talking about or, you know, so, but there could also have been people like the other guy who translated the Russian work, and so he maybe like was using that as okay, look, we do exist as a Palestinian people, even though other people might be like, what the fuck are you talking about? So, and in Yusuf's case, if I remember correctly, he said like dude, don't speak for my family history. Like, don't tell me how our family identified themselves.
He wasn't just speaking on behalf of his own family. Had he said, listen, my family, you know, my grandfather told me X, Y, or Z, I'm like, that's fascinating. I'll share that.
Right.
But that's not what he wrote.
Right. Sure. Yeah. It's just fun to watch you because there's another guy that I also saw you got into a fight with. I think he's like a black Christian guy, Dunami, Washington.
I know you're talking about. I forget his exact name, but it's something like that. Yeah.
It's just like the characters that you bump into online. Like, there's something about you that pisses people off, or maybe it's the other way around. But
yeah, look, I never intentionally sought to like wade into these controversies. It just so happens that I happen to spend many, many years doing research on a topic that people are constantly spreading misinformation about.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's like, hey, thanks for the softball, thanks for the lob. Like, I'm gonna correct that. That's just, yeah, I just don't appreciate people spreading, because here's the thing, like, people are so convinced they're right. I'm like, dude, I spent 10 years doing research on this question. Like, you just don't know what you're talking about. And then they'll like screenshot like a sentence from a book about like a history of the Middle East, and there'll be like one sentence about how, you know, Arabs didn't identify as Palestinian at some period in time in a book about basically like a broad history of the Middle East. And they're like, look, it's proof. It was published in a book in, you know, 1984. And it's like, dude, do you know the difference between a primary source and a secondary source? I was like, can you show me the footnote? And it's just citing some other secondary source, which is citing some other secondary source, which is citing a book that is outdated. And my PhD dissertation is the most updated historical version of the origins of a Palestinian identity. Like, that's the best we got. You know, no one has spent 10 years digging through as many references as they could find to Palestinians in Arabic literature, in the journals and newspapers and books published in Arabic from the 19th century and early 20th centuries. We're niche. That is what you do in academia. You develop a niche expertise. My expertise, that very niche, is on a topic that people are tweeting misinformation about.
Yeah. What describe those 10 years? I mean, you're literally pouring through journals and newspaper articles from 1898.
Well, I think my starting point was that I don't know when I should start. Because when you're looking for the origins of something, you could have. What if you had only started looking just in the decades or centuries before that? Maybe you would have found Palestinian identity in the 18th century or the 16th century. Yeah. So I started from the proposition that I don't know when things started. Let me just start with the first written records in history, because clearly you're not going to find evidence of Palestinians before that.
That's man. That's okay. So and you said when did that start? What year? 18 what?
Right. So by the way, you have evidence of a Palestinian identity in the 10th century. You have a guy named Al-Maqdisi. He's a geographer, or Al-Muqaddisi. It's not clear which pronunciation is correct, but basically you had this Palestinian. You had this guy who wrote a book called Ahsan al-Taqasim fi Ma'rifat al-Taqalim, I believe. Excuse me. And basically it's this book of, it's basically like a kind of a, let's call it like a geography book about his travels. Al-Maqdisi traveled around the Muslim world. He goes to Iran. He goes to Shiraz. And he meets this stonecutter in Shiraz. And the stonecutter asks him, where are you from? And he says, I'm Palestinian. I'm a Falastini. In the 10th century, this guy dies in 995.
Okay.
So we're talking 1,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. You have a guy calling himself Palestinian.
Okay, but one dude,
now I'm not.
why didn't this shit catch on? Come on now.
You also have many hadith commentators. So in a hadith you have the chain of transmitters, right? Because the idea with hadith is like Muhammad's sayings and doings.
Okay.
The prophets, the sayings and doings of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and so you basically had all these commentators.
Wait, what was that last?
Nah, I'm just fucking around. You know how you have, like, if a Jew will say something, they'll be like,
Baruch Hashem,
Yamach Shemo or something like that. They'll say things like, Muslims will say after they say the Prophet's name, they'll say, anytime they say, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they'll say, like, may peace and blessings be upon him.
Okay.
So anyways,
got it.
You had all these hadith transmitters. And it was important to know where the transmitter was transmitting the hadith, because you wanted to make sure this was a real hadith and not a fake hadith, because you had all these basically all this fake news getting circulated around the Muslim world, these fake hadiths. People would just make them up, and so in order to be able to distinguish between the real ones and the fake ones, why? Well, I can think of some reasons, but because this is the word of God. Sorry, not the word of God, but this is what Muhammad said. Muhammad had these divine revelations, so. If you came up with a hadith that said like, Muslims should do this, that, or the other, then that would be sort of the way you would justify passing a law or passing a new regulation or introducing a new tax or etc. or conquering a new land. Look, Muhammad said so. So there were all these reasons. So all these reasons that all these fake hadiths came about.
Is the hadith about finding the Jew behind the tree and killing him and all that? Is that a real one, or please tell me that's fake news?
Yeah, it's a good question. We would have to look into that. I don't have an answer for you.
That's a bad one, man.
There's some look,
causes a lot of
the Quran
trouble.
is like the Hebrew Bible. You can find whatever you want in it. You can find the parts that say
there's no fucking passage in the Bible that says kill the Muslims.
But there's a passage in I believe it's the book of Joshua, the second book of Joshua, where the people of Israel are commanded to annihilate the Canaanim. To commit genocide against the indigenous inhabitants of the land of Israel.
That's not Muslims, man. Come on.
Well, all I'm saying is that whatever certainly in the Jewish and Muslim and Christian holy books, you can find evidence for love and peace, and you can find evidence for war and genocide.
No problem, man. But I'm just saying that's a shitty passage. It causes a lot of trouble.
Yeah, there's no question that Islam, Judaism, Christianity have been the source of a tremendous amount of bloodshed over the years.
Tough. Yeah. So it's just. Do you get into these online fights a lot? Did you find it? Is it?
What can I say? Like
what
I have a point of view.
What is your online personality? Are you always sort of engaged in battle, or?
I don't know. Do I strike you as a very pugnacious person? I try and be reasonable.
But you're also, I think you're very steadfast in your views. You've done your work, and I think, yeah, you don't back down from an argument. But I also think that you're respectful, which is great.
Try and be respectful.
Yeah.
Try and admit when I'm wrong, and I have admitted I'm wrong many, many times online. Look, I got this wrong. Thanks for the correction. Hey, I shouldn't have phrased this that way.
Yeah.
I think it came across as maybe, a little bit problematic the way I framed this thread. Here's a correction. Like,
Yeah.
I'll issue those kinds of things all the time when I think I erred in judgment.
Yeah.
I'm the first one to admit I'm wrong. Like, that's how we all get better. That's
Sure.
how we all refine our understanding of the world.
Yeah.
Is when we say, look, I got things wrong. And that's the point of Twitter. That's the point of YouTube. That's the point of talking through these things online, because look, I'm wrong all the time. Other people should also admit when they're wrong. I mean, I think that's why I want to learn. I want to put something out there and then have the internet tell me what I got right and what I got wrong. And that'll help me refine my understanding of things.
Have you refined your way of arguing online? Because, for example, like I'll take the argument with Yusuf. So he makes a move. He says there's no such thing as a Palestinian national identity until the 1960s. You say, that's not true. And then he comes back with a side move, which just says, like, basically, I'm an Arab. My family is obviously Arab. And who the hell are you to tell me, despite whatever you've done in the past 10 years, my family history, which is not the same claim as what he made before.
Correct.
Which is that's not an argument. That's just like a side conversation.
You change the argument,
right? Yeah.
Look, if I came and told you, look, my family has identified as Ashkenazi, since the 15th century.
Well, no, but my point there is not whether who's right or wrong, but it's more like the spirit that you bring to these entanglements is one of goodwill, but also respect for the truth.
Respect for the truth,
right?
100%.
And do you feel that there's a way to, because arguing with people online is not easy. But do you find that there's a way to sort of bring people back into the point of contention and trying to find ground truth? No.
I mean, that's why I try my best to cite my sources. I'll never write anything without sources. I'm screenshotting, I'm linking, I'm trying to make sure that I'm grounding myself in facts and truth and evidence. And unfortunately, most people aren't doing that. I mean, it's especially someone like Yusuf Haddad, who's just spewing his own opinions without having no basis in evidence or facts, just no attempt to even try and defend himself with evidence. I mean, he's not even trying. He's just making shit up.
Well,
so how do you debate with someone like that?
I don't follow him too closely, but he does point out facts, things that are factual. So
look,
he does. There is this narrative of Arabs being second-class citizens, and yet the chairman of I think either the biggest or the second biggest bank is an Arab. You have, of course, Arabs who were in the government not long ago, but obviously a long history of Arab politicians.
Yeah,
doing a silly job representing their constituents in the country. It's not as bad as people would make it out to be or would like it to be.
I mean, you sound like corporate PR. It's kind of like
no, and like just him as an example of someone who can rise rather quickly in the hierarchy. I mean, you might call him a sellout or something, but still,
I wouldn't use that term.
But okay, well, someone might, right? Like, or an Uncle Tom or something like that. But there are people Arabs who are successful. Even for example, I was this weekend traveling with my son. We were doing a hike and we stopped for lunch in an Arab town. And I tell you, I don't see really much of a difference between that town that I stopped in and some majority Jewish towns. Like, they look very, very similar, and the houses are big and the infrastructure is there. Like, it's fine, it's normal.
I suppose when I hear someone like Yusuf Haddad talk about how Arabs have the right to vote in Israel, and Arabs have freedom of religion in Israel, and Arabs have free healthcare in Israel, it kind of reminds me of a Meta spokesperson in 2017 talking about how we support small businesses and we support freedom of speech and we're doing all these great things. Well, it's like, well, sure, like, good for you, but you're also probably the reason why teen suicide is an all-time high. and why teen depression is at an all-time high, and girls cutting themselves is at an all-time high, and you're probably also contributed to a massive amount of misinformation being spread on your platforms that has led to all kinds of horrible outcomes. So, yeah, you could be the corporate PR person if you want, or you could stand on the side of human rights. It's sort of up to you.
Come on. I mean, even in the case of Facebook Meta, yes, it's a company of that size and scale with so many users all around the world cannot possibly control what's going on that platform, and you're gonna have shitty people doing shitty things on that platform with crazy reach. But that doesn't negate the good that's also on the platform. For example, just people use it to do things that are very communal and social and gatherings and just connecting with people. Like both things can be true.
And I think
both things are true, I would say, right?
And that's why we have these incredible public debates, right? That's what the public square is there for.
So may perhaps Yusuf is highlighting the benefits of life as an Arab in Israel more so to your liking, or presenting half the picture, but that doesn't mean that his half of the picture is incorrect.
Totally agree.
Right.
No question about that. I mean, you can spend your time talking about how amazing the world is, and I'm not really sure what purpose that serves.
Because hang on a second. Come on, man. The world is amazing.
Well, maybe I should have rephrased that.
Let's start with
the world is. I love talking about how great life is. By the way, I would have rephrased that. What I really mean to say here is when we're talking about states and we're talking about it just strikes me as odd that the outcome of you talking about how great things are for Arabs in Israel is that it's probably going to make it harder to convince people that actually they're not equal. Actually, the 91% of the land of Israel cannot be leased by an Arab.
Huh? What's that?
The vast majority of the land, the physical land inside the state of Israel, cannot be bought or it's really because no one can buy land. It's all state owned, so you lease it for 99 years, but it cannot be leased for 99 years. The vast majority is basically off limits to Arabs.
How so?
Well, most of the land, something like I think roughly 80% of the land of the state of Israel is under the control of these basically these municipal councils.
Okay.
These the moshavim and the kibbutzim, it's under their control.
Yeah.
And they decide who moves into their moshav or their kibbutz or their municipality.
Okay.
And there's a long history of Arabs being denied access to those communities.
But Jews as well, right? Like they're very selective who they.
Well, Arabs as a category, right? Maybe certain Jews for certain reasons, but Arabs as a category, that's disqualifying you. So, and then another 10% or so, 11% of the land of the country is owned by the Jewish National Fund, JNF, whose explicit purpose is to develop land for Jews, to benefit Jews.
And do you not think though that there's some culpability within the Arab community for not being more forceful in demanding their rights? In other words, the politicians who rise up within those communities and take a salary and all the perks and all the benefits of belonging to the parliament, Knesset, that instead of dealing with issues like that, are dealing with issues that are, not germane to people's day-to-day lives, and not getting your hands dirty by being part of the system itself, right? They are citizens of a country. They take that upon themselves, that responsibility. So if you want to make serious change, if you want to improve the lives of the people that elected you into that office and give you that lifestyle, it's incumbent upon you to then work from within the system to do whatever is best, what is most effective to then help your community. Now, that means getting your hands dirty. That means playing with
100%,
playing in the rules, and
100%.
You know?
I'm totally on board with what you just said. I
Like that was so
civic.
cool that there was an Arab party in the Israeli government a year ago. That was a fucking miracle. That was amazing.
Yeah, I completely agree. I wish not just Arabs. I wish everyone it took a part in the civic process.
Sure.
I think society's a much better place when people care.
Yeah.
When people say what they believe and take part in the, start civil society organizations and vote and protest.
I would say that a belief in the sacredness and the how special life is a prerequisite to have as an attitude to then say, okay, I'm going to go get my hands dirty in the real world. I'm going to go, I'm going to go join a government with Jewish people of all sorts, and we're going to work something out, and we're going to make life that much a little bit better for our communities, because it's important, and our job isn't there to just show up and not do anything and just sort of wave the flag of we're for human rights and not actually do anything about it. You got to get in there and make shit happen. It doesn't happen on its own.
Look, I mean, it's probably much easier for Arabs inside Israel to have that view. But if
Yeah.
you're an Arab in the West Bank,
No, I'm not talking about them.
Yeah.
That's way
No.
more. That's way more.
being
difficult.
political means you're never going to travel, you're never going to get a work permit in Israel, you're never going to,
Right.
etc. So, there are real consequences to that. And by the way, also in Israel, I mean, I think, that's certainly the case with many Palestinian friends of mine who just want to lead their lives, just want to go to, raise a family, have a good life, are not. They know the more political they are, probably the more problems they're gonna have trying to find a job. Maybe they want to work in the bureaucracy. The more political they are, the less likely it is they'll get the positions they want. Right? This is an incredibly difficult place to be Palestinian.
In Israel.
Yeah. Oh, in Israel.
Uh-huh.
From an identity perspective,
Sure, man.
from a loyalty perspective,
Yeah.
just the day to day of I think it was during one of the reasons, just to cite one anecdote here, in they interviewed a ton of Palestinians who were working in Israel during just before the first Intifada, and they asked, and Palestinians who protested during the first Intifada and went out to the streets and threw stones at tanks, and they asked them, why did you go out to the streets and protest? And you know what they said? They said that it was the humiliation they faced working inside Israel. It was whenever there would be some kind of attack, or whenever, that they would face the brunt. Whenever, there would be some, thing that happened to a Jew at the hands of the Palestinians, they would be humiliated. Their paychecks would be, their pay would be cut. They would lose their benefits. They would be forced to work overtime. They were just treated like total shit. And that humiliation that they faced. And by the way, that's the case even today. I mean, so I think it's a really tough place to be Palestinian. It's, the amount of, just trying to rent an apartment. A Palestinian friend was telling me how when she was trying to rent an apartment, you had all these landlords just refusing to rent to her. I mean, this is like, go back, maybe in 1970s, 80s, you have to go back 30, 40 years in the United States to really have that kind of widespread discrimination in the housing. It still exists today, obviously, but it's much more muted. But it's not muted in Israel today. The landlords will just straight up tell you that you cannot live here. There was just a report. I was like mainstream, even like right-wing Israeli media does these reports where an Arab goes to try and become a member of a swimming pool, or a gym, and they tell them, oh, sorry, we don't have any open slots, and then they just literally call this someone without an accent, and they change the name. Oh, well, please welcome. We have plenty of open spaces.
Yeah.
And this is just daily life. There's nothing even special about that. That happens everywhere an Arab goes in Israel. Just discrimination everywhere you go.
Yeah.
At the airport, at a checkpoint, in the workplace, at schools. The differences between the budgetary allocations between Palestinian municipalities and Jewish municipalities, the Judaization of the Galilee, the Judaization of the Negev, the Judaization of Jerusalem. It's a tough place to be a Palestinian Arab. Most Palestinian Arabs I know inside Israel want to leave.
Really?
They want to live abroad. They don't want to be politicized every single minute of their life. They don't want to be considered to be a fifth column. That's life for most Arabs inside Israel. It's not the Yusuf Haddad's version of wow,
Whoa.
Look, we're all equal, Muslims, Jews praying next to each other, la di da di da.
How would you How would you know exactly? I mean, this is anecdotal. This is, because you probably have a filter to look through things just with the inputs that you're getting. That is, Jesus, this is, it's widespread discrimination. Um, this talk of fifth column, all this stuff, but there must be, in fact, I'm sure there is, plenty of friendly relations between Jews and Arabs.
100%. I
Right.
don't mean to imply that most,
Because it could be that the people that you speak to were like, fuck this place. I want to get the hell out of here. Let's go move to Berlin where everything is fine. But I don't know.
look, I'm trying to imply that Jews and Palestinians inside Israel were with one another. Obviously not. Although things did devolve into chaos in 2021.
It's terrible. Yeah.
So like we're not that far from there. By the way, could easily happen again, and it could be 100 times worse next time.
Yeah.
Could actually be a real civil war in this country.
Yeah.
Not between Jews and Jews like what's happening now, between Jews and Palestinians. I mean, there could be multiple types of civil wars in this country. So. But yeah, look, I mean, people living their lives day to day, of course, but it's not that far below the surface. That's what I would say.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, in that sense, life can be pretty brutal, but as a species, we came pretty close to extinction, not several tens of thousands of years ago, and we're still here. And the question is why? And I think that the human condition is tough, and the only thing that justifies it is love, man.
I wish there was more love in the world. That's a great point.
And at some point we recognize that, and we survive, right? And we find a way to live, and it has to happen here at some point. I don't know how. It's got to be it, man. Like, you have to, at some point, people are going to wake up and walk the streets and look at someone that they don't know, and a stranger, and realize that they're not that different. They have different ideas swirling around their head, but their concerns, their day-to-day, this question of what they're supposed to do with their short time on earth, like, it's all the same, man. It's the human condition. And what makes it great, what makes it bearable, what makes it worth it is love, right? It's having friends and family and a meaning in life and helping other people, like that's it, right? And that doesn't change across any society. Like, that's just what it's all about. And it expresses itself in its own way, but we have to be able to respect those manifestations, right? So long as they're grounded in love. And this is just going back to my earlier point about the Palestinian vision. It's like, I want to see a Palestinian vision of love. Because if it's grounded in that, I think you would see a massive opening in an Israeli society. Like, oh, that's a different voice. It's a voice we haven't really heard of. Because it's one thing to say, I'm non-violently protesting your oppression. Fair enough. But give me something that's like, we see you, now see us, and we're not so far apart, from a world where we don't have this crazy story running around in our minds that we have to kill each other. Like, this is what I'm trying to get at. Like, we're so close and we don't even realize it, and it's sad.
I think most Palestinians would say exactly the same thing about Israelis. It's like, why can't these people just show some love? Why can't they just treat us like human beings?
But I think that that there have been some rather serious overtures over the years to say, look, okay, we cannot continue to rule over you guys. Like, there have been voices saying, this is corrosive to our soul, right? We're sending people out there, and these people who are young, policing over people that they don't want to police, and this shapes their adulthood. And there have been efforts to stop this, right? Several peace processes. And I know that there's differing interpretations of who blew it up, but good Lord, man, you didn't see an Israeli. You didn't see a Ehud Olmert in 2000 say, well, fuck it, now let's go raid a bunch of Palestinian villages, right? No, we have to get suicide bombings as a result of failed talks or broken down talks. Like, this is no good, and I'm not saying that Israel is faultless. Like, that's certainly not the case. And you're right, more love from the other side would be great, but it's got to be reciprocal. And in my view, and I know that you'll disagree, but if the narrative from the other side is as it is, then I think it's incumbent upon them to say, let's make a clean break here and say, we as a people are about love for ourselves and therefore love for the other side. And okay, how do we solve this damn thing such that not another person has to lose their life for no fucking point? Because it's pointless. It's just perpetual, and it's such a waste of human potential, and it's just a tragedy. And it's a tragedy built upon another tragedy. And we all have to come to this realization, and the sooner the better, because it's possible to fix this and arrange things in such a way where this doesn't have to happen, And I wish it were so.
Amen to that, my brother.
Good talking to you, man.
Yeah, likewise.
It's true, man.